Part 5. Building Ancient Egypt. 2650 to 2550 BC. 26. A Diadem of Pyramids. 2650 to 2625 BC. After Dahshur, the royal masons moved a few hundred yards to the south and west of the step pyramid's enclosure and began to build a slightly larger pyramid at the center of a somewhat narrower enclosure, and they rationalized the work, using larger and more regularly sized building blocks and employing smaller quantities of imported stone. But the new pharaoh, once Sekemkhet, seems to have died after only a few years of rule, for building at the enclosure was stopped whilst the best part of it had yet to be completed. Although the pyramid itself had barely reached the top of its first step, the quarrying of rows of subterranean magazines in the corridors and staircases leading to the royal burial crypt had been well advanced, and in the 1950s, on their way down to the burial chamber which lies beneath the center of the pyramid, archaeologists found stone vases, the remains of wooden furniture and some gold jewelry which, along with a well-made wall that blocked their further progress, led them to believe that a royal burial lay undisturbed beneath the pyramid. This conviction was further encouraged when the sealed wall was breached to reveal another, and then another, until finally they entered a low square room, roughly cut into the desert limestone. A fine sarcophagus lay at its center, made from a single shining block of fine Van Hattenub alabaster with what seemed to be an ancient wreath draped extravagantly across its top. In the heady days of 1954, just 2 years after the Egyptian Revolution, major excavations at Saqqara were being controlled and led for the first time by an Egyptian, Zakaria Ghanem, the pyramid's discoverer, and suddenly the world's press was camping at the doorway of the old government inspectorate where he was living. From a pharaoh's tomb comes a gleam of gold, the headlines yelled, for there was no evidence of robbery within the tomb, and the sarcophagus was plastered shut. So for a month and more, journalists and their hundreds trailed through the loose sand and down into that hot, dark cavern, a pilgrimage that ceased abruptly when the sarcophagus was opened and found to be entirely and mysteriously empty. Now, the press reported, it was a pharaoh fiasco. Nonetheless, Sekemkhet's unfinished pyramid holds many treasures, for the drifts of sand and chip that cover a great part of the enclosure had hidden the relics of ancient pyramid building in progress, the masons' yards and the stone hauling ramps that had ceased operation in mid-flow when the work was stopped. Sand drifts also covered parts of the pyramid's enclosure walls, which are skillful duplications of those that the craftsmen masons had made earlier for Dahshur. And here, the pristine surface of a new-made wall had invited dozens of graffiti and builder's marks, some scribbled pictures and a few short texts, one of which names Imhotep as if he were still alive. Inked by practiced hands, the swift and abbreviated hieroglyphics of some of these graffiti underline the loss of a wealth of contemporary documentation that had presumably been written out on papyrus or other fragile media and stored away from the preserving deserts and settlements beside the valley farmlands, where the bulk of the population lived. Following Sekemkhet, another pyramid was started to house the burial of another shadowy monarch named, so it would appear, King Kaba, whilst showing little ambition to build larger or higher than the earlier pyramids. Once again the new project rationalized their previous work, and this was the beginning of a process of development and change that the pyramid builders would continue throughout the next half-century. Yet this pyramid, too, was never finished, and as for the next king in the line, his burial place remains unknown. His very name, Sanikht, is only recorded in some scattered seal impressions and a few rare inscriptions. Beyond the 2 unfinished pyramids, a handful of inscriptions and some rock reliefs around the copper mines at Sinai. Hardly any history has been preserved from the decades that followed Dahshur and his massive monuments. Even the reign of Sekemkhet had passed unrecognized, until Ghanem found evidence of the king's name on some jar ceilings and some other fragments left in the corridors of his unfinished pyramid. Then, At the ending of these hazy rains, a sprinkling of little pyramids was cast down along the valley of the lower Nile, built in the distinctive manner of the earlier pyramids. Each one rose in 3 or 4 sloping steps and, with one exception, each was around 60 feet square at its base. None of them, however, shows any trace of burial arrangements, and most of them, it appears, were made in the reign of a single monarch, the last pharaoh of the 3rd dynasty, a king called Huni. In common with his predecessors, little is known of Huni, nor has his tomb been found, though it is likely that it lay to the south of Saqqara, on the wide desert plain behind the village of Dahshur, from where a few rare monuments of his age, 2 grand alabaster sarcophagi and a splendid relief panel of the king himself, appear to have originated. Standard, though far later, ancient sources record that the last king of the 3rd dynasty, who was, presumably, the man we now call Huni, reigned for some 20 years. Whilst conveniently corresponding with the present mathematics of Egyptian chronology, such information would be of little import, were it not for the fact that this now largely empty period of time must have been one of considerable enrichment and enlargement for the kingdom on the lower Nile. For the reign which followed Huni's, that of the first king of MaidumThe's 4th dynasty, was that of Sneferu, in which some 20 million tons of cut stone blocks were quarried, transported and set up on 3 great royal pyramids. A dizzying progress in monumental engineering that culminated in the reign of Sneferu's successor, Khufu, and the construction of the largest and most perfect pyramid of all, the Great Pyramid of Giza, in the provinces. Just as a great part of the history of the beginning of pharaonic Egypt is held in the pottery and ceilings found on the late Nile supply routes, so too a great part of the kingdom's continuing history is held in the well-laid stones of the early pyramids that rise today, like mountains from the desert. It is a history, therefore, of ambition and efficiency. A history based on the state's continuing and increasing prosperity, which, in an age when monetary wealth did not exist, was founded on the increasing populations of the lower Nile, which so best estimates presently suggest, rose steeply in the centuries between Narmer and Sneferu from under 1 million people to around 1.5 million. What is remarkable in this is that such fast rising populations were able not only to grow enough food to sustain themselves, but at the same time produce sufficient surpluses to maintain a huge labor force that was not working on the land at all, but building a succession of gigantic pyramids. Such enormous surpluses could hardly have been derived from tithing subsistence farmers and were, in fact, a product of several different factors. Fundamentally, there was the phenomenal and constant fertility of the valley of the lower Nile, and a radical change in the court system of collection and distribution of the kingdom's resources. Founded in the 1st dynasty, a system that appears to have depended on the presence of the king and audience at the various settlements had by the time of the 4th dynasty been replaced by a class of yeoman land managers operating at a local level as part of a nationwide system of court provision and supply. In common with most of the activities of ancient life along the lower Nile, most of the evidence of this development has disappeared. 2 elements, however, survive: the standing pyramids, which hold mountains of statistics concerning the materials and energies required for their creation, and the agricultural lands that ultimately fueled their construction and which still hold information about the pyramid makers' resources that is as fundamental as that which is contained within the pyramids themselves. For though different tools and seed stocks were introduced into the Nile Valley in classical times, and little specific is known about farming methods in early dynastic Egypt, the fundamental parameters of food production in the mono-environment of the lower Nile hardly changed until a century and a half ago, when the great river dams started to be constructed and engine-driven water pumps came into use. Remarkably, the millennial processes of agriculture on the lower Nile were mapped in the last years of the 18th century, as part of a Napoleonic doomsday book compiled during the course of the French invasion of Egypt. As you would expect, the French surveyor's plans show a narrow limestone valley cut deep into the desert, with the great river at its center and a natural floodplain lying on either side of it, deep in river silt, in the Nakwad and heartlands. This band of black and cultivatable land was but a mile or so across, a pattern that remained until the introduction of land reclamation and desert farming in the last half-century. In its day, however, that narrow natural floodplain had been a practical width for farmers working with hand tools, for, with the aid of skillfully sited embankments set at angles to the river's bank, they had trapped the receding floodwaters of the annual inundation and thus prolonged the land's fertility. In direct consequence of this same system, millennially applied, the French maps show a continuous ribbon of cultivated land running right down the center of the desert valley, dotted with settlements and farmed, as were the fields of Europe before the arrival of the tractor, in narrow strips in which crops were planted side by side, as if in a garden. This, then, was the broad pattern of the cultivated lands in Sneferu's kingdom, though at that time the regions of cultivation would have been interspersed between considerable areas of uncultivated land. A large part of the subsequent economic history of the pharaonic state, indeed, is the history of the colonization of those scrublands and wild water meadows and the creation of that unbroken stable landscape that Napoleon's geographers would so diligently map. Samples of the remaining seed from Djoser's enormous underground granaries have been found to contain more than 30 plant species, a similar mix of grain and field weeds, darnel, canary grass and vetches and the rest, that was to be found in Egyptian wheat fields until a century or so ago. Watered by basin irrigation, this single annual crop took so little from the fruitful silt that it could be planted each and every year without further effort or ado. This was the fundamental unit of pharaonic agriculture. In contrast, most of the remaining crops were cultivated, as they had been until quite recently, either in more protected areas that held the water of the inundation longer and were the last to dry out in a summer's heat, or on plantations set close to canals or the natural branches of the river that ran parallel to the main stream in many sections of its valley, which were then watered throughout every season so that, in the natural hothouse of the Nile Valley, vegetables would grow around the year. Only the delta, where an estimated fifth of the population of King Sneferu's kingdom lived, would have presented a different agricultural environment. Sown, in part brackish salty wetlands, in part fen and water meadow, the seeds that have been gathered from the remains of farming settlements of those times show a growing emphasis on the cultivation of animal fodder, which was not the case, as similarly detailed studies have shown, in Upper Egypt. Such specialization appears to have been a growing trend from Djoser's time, if not earlier, in which some delta farms had developed a regime of rearing beef cattle in stalls, so that the animals grew to a considerable size and would develop long, curved hoofs due to lack of exercise, a quality that reflects the description of such animals in later pharaonic tax registers as fattened cattle. Seeds from such farming units show that their principal fodder was probably the same kind of dense, dark clover that is still widely used throughout provincial Egypt, where it is called berseem and is harvested continuously, as required. Interestingly, the seeds of wild mustard and dock that have been found mixed in with those of delta clover appear to have been imported from Upper Egypt, along with the clover seed itself. Some of the delta estates, therefore, seem to have been specialized agricultural centers that, apart from producing the usual field crops such as wheat and flax, were developing an export industry in which large numbers of the cattle that were especially favored as beasts of ritual offering were shipped all over Egypt. Some of these animals, indeed, may have been slaughtered in Djoser's pyramid temple, where the drains and basins are large enough to hold the great beast's blood after their throats had been cut. At the same time, in those undocumented decades between the reigns of Djoser and Sneferu, the ongoing spread of cemeteries shows that sections of the central river valley known now as Middle Egypt, where the flood plain could not be easily adapted to the small-scale methods of basin irrigation used by the earlier farmers, were being increasingly colonized. At this same time, too, some of the most ancient centers of Nakwadan society, which had previously been depopulated, were enlarging once again. Though mostly unexcavated, the remains of substantial settlements at Abydos, Hierakonpolis and Nakata show that those traditional centers were flourishing, whilst a string of excavations in the huge desert cemeteries that lie downstream from Abydos, at sites like El Rakakna and Nag el-Dir, have recorded thousands of burials of the same period. These, presumably, were of people who had been supported by the produce of local farms, underlining their direct and continuing relationship with the court at Memphis. One of the enormous contemporary mud brick mastabas at Beit Khalif, another of the sites near Abydos, contained mud jar ceilings, bearing the impression of the name of Djoser, while another mastaba contained a seal impression of one of Huni's predecessors, King Sanik. At first it would appear that Sanik's broken seal impression by itself is hardly proof of the growing power and reach of a centralizing state. It is, however, typical of the evidence available from those lost decades of a vast and enlarging national network, whose existence could only otherwise be inferred from the statistics of provision and supply that are built into the pyramid's own stones. But though Sanik himself has hardly left a mark on history in his very tomb is lost, wherever his name is found, it is always connected to the networks of state supply. It is found, for example, on a seal impression excavated in Djoser's pyramid temple at Saqqara that testifies to the continuance of offerings at Djoser's funerary compound long after that king's demise. It is in the tomb at Beit Khalif, and, at the Sinai copper mines, two reliefs of that elusive king are set close to those of Djoser, Sekemket, and Sneferu. And it is also found at the Aswan Cataract where, in the course of the German Archaeological Institute's excavations, Sanik's name was found impressed into a tiny blob of fine Nile mud that, as the indentations on its reverse revealed, had once sealed a long perished roll of papyrus, recovered from the debris of the office that had been established in the Second Dynasty on a small island next to the great brick fortress of the First Dynasty. The seal that held Sanik's name had belonged to an administrator and was one of 20 similar sealings which the ruined building had inadvertently preserved. In the manner of the times, the sealings held the names and titles of several individuals, some descriptions of various quantities of now vanished goods in the years of rule of some of the kings, unfortunately unnamed, in which those goods were sealed, underlining the connection of these islands with the state systems of distribution and supply. Several other seal impressions bearing the names of Third Dynasty kings have also been found in the Aswan excavations, and these, too, had come from mud-sealed storage jars. Though less informative and far less plentiful, similar seal impressions have also been found at a scattering of other sites. At El Kab, for example, which lies on the opposing bank of the river to Hierakonpolis, a Belgian expedition recovered another seal impression of an inspector of the granary, and some fine pieces made in the court workshops including a hard stone vessel bearing the name of Sneferu, were excavated from the largest tombs within the local cemetery, together with similar goods that have been found in cemeteries both in the valley and the delta. These are the earliest evidence of royal patronage and, apparently, of provincial officials who were in contact with the royal court. Aswan, however, offers further insight into the transformations that were taking place during those lost decades, and evidence of a strengthening network of authority and obligation throughout the kingdom. Close by the office on its little granite island in the middle of the river's stream, there stands one of the small stepped pyramids that were placed along the valley of the lower Nile at the end of the Third Dynasty, 60 feet square and built of limestone blocks in a manner typical of its times. The little pyramid, which was set at the island's highest point, once rose in 3 angled steps to a height of around 35 feet. and a brief inscription on a single column-shaped block of granite informs us that its name was the Diadem of King Huni. 6 similar pyramids are known at present and others may well lie undetected. All are small and stepped and, before their part demolition by 19th century treasure seekers, they had been completely solid. One stands near Edfu, some of the others near Hierakonpolis, Nikata, and Abydos, and all of them were, apparently, anonymous. Then, in the late 1980s, excavations at the northernmost of these distinctive pyramids, which is set close to the modern village of Sela in the hills between Lake Fayoum and the valley of the Nile, uncovered an alabaster offering altar, some fragments of a royal statue and a stela bearing the name of Huni's immediate successor, Sneferu, in conjunction with the discovery of the office set close to the pyramid at Aswan. The discoveries at the Sela pyramid solved one of the minor mysteries of Egyptology. For now it appeared that, although they had no burial chambers of their own, these small stepped pyramids had been built as miniature versions of the grand royal pyramids, particularly the finished pyramid of Djoser, with its statues and offering temple, and that they had performed similar roles, by proxy, to that of Djoser's pyramid temple, marking offering and tithing places of the royal cult, and serving as markers for the reception and dispatch of goods gathered and dispensed in the royal name, just as the ceilings found at Aswan had implied. As Stefan Seidelmeyer, the excavator of the Aswan office first observed, the positions of these little pyramids up and down the valley of the Nile is reminiscent of some of the later divisions of the Nile Valley into the 20-odd provinces which, along with an equal number of others in the Nile Delta, are now known under the Greek term of nomes. Though the origins of this system of provinces are unknown, some of these nomes are already named in the short text inscribed on the vases that were stored underneath King Djoser's pyramid. Amongst others, the so-called Oryx nome, the province in which the alabaster quarries of Hatnub were situated. By Sneferu's time, however, a far wider range of these province names appears on a variety of inscriptions. That some of these record the names of provincial officials and others describe landholdings by the names of the nomes in which they were situated suggests that the nome system was part of a parceling out of Egypt, part of the kingdom's developing systems of provision and supply in a further stage, as well, in the continuing process of internal colonization along the valley of the Lower Nile. With its inscription of King Sneferu, the Sela pyramid is somewhat different from the others. The rest of this group of little pyramids are so similar in their sizes and methods of construction that is it likely that they were all built at the same time, and probably, therefore, during Huni's reign. And if that is true, then the diadem of little pyramids that had been sprinkled out along the Nile in the age before the building of Egypt's greatest pyramids would appear as an elaborate architectural expression of the rites of audience and offering that, from the very beginning, had been the quintessence of the state. 27. Court and country. Metjen in the early reign of Sneferu, 2625 to 2600 BC. Walked north past the walls of the step pyramids enclosure and out the dusty track that led to the old government inspectorate in Merkez Mastaba, and he will pass by a number of undistinguished stacks of mud brick that are slowly dissolving into the sand. In all probability, though in the absence of any inscriptions it is no longer possible to be entirely sure, one of these fast-fading structures, the ruined remnants of a considerable cemetery, belonged to a certain Metjen, an official of King Sneferu's court, whose mastaba once held a remarkable series of stone reliefs that in the 19th century were shipped to Europe for exhibition in Berlin. Unlike the tomb of Hesi, with its row of wooden panels, each one in a separate niche spaced out along the corridor, the reliefs that Lepsius took from Metjen's tomb chapel had been arranged so that their images were set all together, focused in a single corridor like 9-foot niche built of stone blocks that ran into the body of the mud brick mastaba. At the ending of this passageway there had stood an offering altar set below a copy of a house door made in stone, a so-called false door dash in which there was an engraved image of Metjen, standing in the manor of Hesi-Re and Djoser, together with a serdab that had been set nearby into the body of the mastaba and which had contained a lovely little granite statue of Metjen. This innovative ensemble, the most elaborate of a dozen other examples that have survived from the same time, had comprised one of the oldest decorated so-called tomb chapels ever to have been found in Egypt, made, in all likelihood, some 2 generations after the nearby tomb of Azire. This novel rearrangement provided more space for text and images and, by combining the various elements of sculpture, inscriptions and tomb reliefs image and text, in a single architectural composition, allowed for a greater coherence, and eloquence even, in the dialogue of the tomb. It is precisely this same new-made expansiveness that makes the text within the tomb of Metjen of such outstanding interest, for they are far more expansive than any earlier examples, and more informative, as well, than any other surviving text of Metjen's time. Here, then, for the first time in Egyptian history, are writings concerning an individual's role within the court, his ownership of various estates, and texts, and even passages that describe some of the land holdings of his mother and his father. Taken all together, they show something of the mundane realities of courtly life during an extraordinary period of history. Metjen, so these inscriptions tell, had traveled to Sneferu's court from a family home in the broad farmlands of Middle Egypt and, as the reliefs from his tomb chapel seem to show, he lived to a ripe old age. And that may indeed be the reason why the old man's tomb was on the Saqqara plateau by King Djoser's pyramid, in the burying grounds of previous generations, rather than with most of the courtly tombs of Sneferu's day, which are located in the deserts to the south of Saqqara, beside the royal pyramids. What first holds the eye in Metjen's tomb chapel is a lively series of reliefs, exquisitely delineating the essential actors of a courtly expedition to the desert. Lines of servants carrying supplies and bedding, for a midday siesta, and lively images of the chase drawn with a hunter's eye, hares and desert rats and a small flock of Dorcas gazelle, some of which the hounds have caught by the leg. Metjen, whose very name when it is translated from hieroglyphic conjures visions of a desert sheik, appears to have been an administrator of the deserts and a controller of the royal hunt. Walk further into the narrow chapel and other elegant reliefs show produce being brought from Metjen's various estates for offering at his tomb, pictures of some of the provisions that earlier generations had piled up in reality within the storerooms of the mastabas, images that from this time on will form a main part of the decorations of the nobles' tomb chapels. It is the lengthy lines and columns of hieroglyphs, however, that hold special interest in Metjen's tomb chapel, for they contain some of the oldest known sentences in the Egyptian language. Nor is this merely an early surviving example of the appearance of a subject and predicate within a line of hieroglyphs. Though they lack the precision of later inscriptions, there is a vivacity in some of these texts that to the modern ear appears to echo elements of speech. Clearly, such novel textual constructions were the products of earlier developments in which writing as a medium of lists, which had recorded little more than objects and quantities, names and sounds, and whose understanding was dependent on its setting within the statewide accounting system, had been transformed into writing that could stand alone as an independent medium, in which lines of signs held grammar in them and something, even, of a speaking voice, beyond some simple phrases, wishes for long life, for many years of rule, and the like, which were composed in the times of the first kings. There is hardly any surviving evidence of the introduction of grammatic structure into hieroglyphic, most of which must have taken place in the few decades between King Djoser and King Sneferu. That Metjen's inscriptions tell us directly that they were copied from writing in a royal document, suggests that those advances have been made in text written on fragile media that have since perished, and serves again to underline the loss of a great mass of early writing that was set down on less permanent materials than Tura limestone. Stonily preserved, parts of Metjen's text give details of his inheritance and properties, Some describe his status at the court, whilst others address that perennial concern of earlier communities of the Lower Nile, the provision of offerings to the dead. And with all of that, they show aspects of state administration in the reign of Sneferu that are otherwise virtually undocumented. A glimpse of the organization that had embarked upon the largest program of stone block building the world would ever see. Metjen was not a member of the royal family. His texts record that he had inherited his father's property with royal assent, however, and that it had come down to him without wheat and barley, but with dependents, and herds of pigs and donkeys. Ownership of such a fine made and well-sited tomb, therefore, had probably resulted from personal contact with the king. In his capacity of master of the hunt, indeed, Metjen may well have spent much time with the inner circle of the royal family, for hunting had long been a popular royal pastime. Favored hounds of the early kings had been buried close to their masters in their own graves, and some of their names Dahshur and said Dash had been individually recorded on stone stele. As well as a royal hunt master, Metjen's tomb texts also describe him as a court official charged with the production of the royal linen, with managing some of the royal estates and with overseeing the offices of provisioning. These were posts which, if their words are literally true, would have provided him with a broad overview of the kingdom and enabled him, with the aid of royal patronage, to accumulate a spread of property which, so his tomb chapel records, consisted of several considerable estates including land holdings of 150 acres in the old Nakwat and Heartlands. So much land did Metjen accumulate, in fact, that his tomb texts tell us he had ceded some 50 acres for the upkeep of his mother's household, the holdings of which Metjen was most proud, however, or at least those that his inscriptions describe in lively detail, are his properties in the western delta, and various new settlements near the northern settlements of Budo and Dahshur and others in nomes closer to Memphis. There, too, as well as controlling various crown estates and developing a series of land holdings in his own name, Metjen also appears to have undertaken civic duties, serving as an arbitrator of disputes. And so successful were these enterprises that he was able to entail the produce of one estate so that it would be sent as offerings to his tomb, where, presumably, it served to support a family of cemetery officials who undertook regular offerings in his tomb chapel. Above all else, however, and very much, as a translation of one of the phrases in his inscriptions frequently proclaims, Metjen founded a series of small holdings such as you may still see in the Egyptian countryside. These were large walled gardens with date palms, fig trees and vines, and where, on occasion, salad and other vegetable crops were cultivated, grapes were pressed, and, as Metjen describes, a very large quantity of wine was made. These, indeed, were the same shaded gardens that, in later ages, pharaonic artists would describe in pictures painted in the nobles' tomb chapels, for both the produce and the luscious perfumed environments of these little paradises were greatly prized. One of Metjen's gardens, so his inscriptions tell, was a generous square of silt of some 2 3/4 acres. Such establishments required a good deal of experience and skill both to establish and to run. Unlike the usual open irrigation systems, which were dependent on the annual inundation, these walled plots required the excavation of an artificial lake or pond from which the gardeners could water their crops around the year. Such work, therefore, required a permanent staff and continuous supplies of water which, so later pictures show, was supplied by digging through the silt to tap the Nile's water table. Such systems also required a careful grading of the soil, even perhaps the addition of manure and extra silt, so that the constant watering that would produce 3 or 4 crops of vegetables each year would drain down swiftly through the rows of trees and plants, and not lie in stagnant pools which, with evaporation, would cause white crusts of salt to form and kill the tender shoots. The opening of such intensive agricultural developments alongside the building of embankments to contain the inundation, and the cleaning and clearing of the wild wetlands, the continuing colonization of the lower Nile Dash was fundamental to the early pharaonic state, and in Metjen's day, his texts imply the king and his courtiers were directly involved in the establishment of just such fresh sources of food production, while at the same time establishing a class of yeoman farmers, Metjen's land managers, who had direct allegiance, through Metjen, to the court and to the king. The meanings of words. It is remarkable that the texts in Metjen's tomb chapel, some of the oldest documents that have survived from ancient Egypt, appear to celebrate the ownership of land and proudly record Metjen's status at a royal court. It is almost as if he were an 18th century country gentleman sitting for a Gainsborough portrait. Great care, however, must be taken with the interpretation of such texts. Though ancient Egyptian writing has a powerful and developing grammatical consistency, in 2 centuries of Western scholarship has enabled its translation with some precision, there yet remain far greater difficulties in its accurate comprehension than is the case with the translation of a living language. Some outstanding questions concerning Metjen's land holdings, for example, would be solved if there were any indication of the identity of the authors of the voice or voices - of the various texts that describe them. Are those inscriptions simply copies of commercial dealings that were originally recorded in a similar manner to that of modern land registries? Or, if the voice of those texts is not that of a state bureaucracy but Metjen's own, are his texts to be understood as a biography, as a list of lands and courtly titles granted by King Sneferu as favors to his hunting master? Choose one of those 2 different voices over another and you choose a different vision of the order within Sneferu's kingdom. If the first alternative were true, then some obscure details perhaps describing Metjen purchasing land from royal colonists would serve to underline his role as a magnate acquiring lands that had previously been awarded to some settlers by royal warrant, as a man, that is, operating in a laissez-faire economy, with an equivalent to money, and with the state acting, in the modern manner, as guarantor of personal property. If the second alternative is correct, however, and those texts are a record of his personal achievements at the court, then they would depict Sneferu's economy as one controlled entirely by the crown, a kingdom in which, in the words of a later autocrat, l'état, c'est moi. Traditional translations of Metjen's text tended to the latter. Modern versions sometimes supply caveats to their interpretations. Another obstacle in the accurate comprehension of Metjen's tomb text, along with others of his time, is that they were written in a period when the hieroglyphic writing system was just beginning to reflect an oral language of itself. This slow move into written text would have been a profound transition for court society and administration, though it is one that is difficult to readily appreciate today since writing, as Roland Barthes once famously observed, has long been the fundamental medium through which our society constructs its institutions, its entertainments and religions. It is precisely our long cultivated tradition of literary precision, indeed, that prompts specific questions as to the voice of Metjen's text, and the ownership and usufruct of his estates. In Metjen's day, such exactitude may not yet have formed a part of everyday experience. A further difficulty in understanding such early texts is that their translation can only be accomplished by reference to other, later texts. And here a paradox rises, for to assume that Metjen's inscriptions are merely primitive versions of later similar examples, and that gaps in their understanding may be resolved by reference to the fuller texts of later times serves to deny internal change within a society that, in Sneferu's day, was clearly undergoing a series of colossal transformations. It is the very nature of most grammars and dictionaries, moreover, to provide compacted, generalizing visions of the language of the culture in which they deal in this, as far as the traditional vision of ancient Egypt is concerned, has created a jargon-filled vocabulary with its own internal mythologies, so that, however rigorous or erudite the act of translation may have been, It often serves to bewitch the genuine relics of the past and reinforce a vision of an ancient Egypt held by earlier generations of lexicographers and philologists. That, of course, is how Metjen can appear to be like an English squire, and Imhotep, an Egyptian Leonardo. How, then, to proceed, when the very language that we use to describe Metjen's world, words like king, courtier, Egypt, estate and all the rest threatens to turn that lost society into a little England? Or, indeed, given that the fundamental hieroglyphic dictionaries in daily use were founded in 19th century Berlin, or warmer Prussia? A simple litmus test, it seems to me, is whether or not our understanding of the ancient text is reliant on explications of such things as ancient symbols or primitive mentalities. Though such dismal metaphysics were second nature to Western colonial societies, there is little evidence of their presence in ancient times. Better to assume, as John Baines puts it, that the developers of writing were surely more intelligent than the generality of their modern interpreters, and to approach the scraps of early writing that survive with humility and the assumption that their present understanding is extremely limited, and that, when they are cast into translation, all ancient words are as quicksilver on the shards of an ancient mirror in which we must inevitably glimpse phantoms of ourselves. 28. High Society. Sneferu at Maidum, 2625 to 2600 BC. A royal palace or, at least, some of the offices of Sneferu's government, once stood upon the desert at Maidum, some 30 miles south of Memphis and on the west bank of the river. For in the first years of his prodigious reign, that great wide plain had been chosen as the location for the royal tomb and, though the area itself has never been systematically surveyed, the archaeology of other sites and later texts both show that the pyramid-building kings built settlements. Besides such works, a palace, the offices and households of the courtiers, and the workshops and habitations of the craftsmen pyramid builders. The presence of government offices on the Maidum plain is further suggested by the nearby pyramid of Sela, one of the little pyramids that had been sprinkled down the valley of the lower Nile in the reigns of Sneferu and his predecessor, Huni, set on a ridge of desert hills that overlooks both Lake Fayum and the valley of the Nile. The little pyramid with its offering table and its stela bearing Sneferu's name is a solid, well-made structure set on a plinth of fine white limestone blocks. When it had stood to its full height, it would have looked down across the wide plain of Maidum and thus would have been clearly visible from Sneferu's pyramid below, two near contemporary monuments 6 miles apart, with the royal residence nearby. None of these monuments, however, would have appeared as they do today. A great part of the Maidum plain is now deep in sand. Sela's pyramid has been part dismantled by treasure seekers, and the Maidum pyramid itself, though sufficiently colossal to discourage such desultory invasions, is so broken and distorted that in the 1870s it was described by an English tourist, somewhat unkindly if not entirely inaccurately, as looking like a slice of double Gloucester. Once, though, that steep-sided block, with the appearance more of a fortress than a tomb, had been a high, white pyramid of 7 steps that, before their various catastrophic collapses, had risen just a little higher than Djoser's great original. From its beginning, the building work at Maidum had been different from that at all earlier pyramid sites. Having planned at least 3 royal pyramid enclosures during the previous half-century, the court builders had already streamlined their building methods. Now, though, the changes were more drastic. The royal burial chamber was reduced to a small room set at the center of the pyramid, and the best part of the earlier pyramid's external architecture, including the grand enclosure walls, was entirely discarded, so that, apart from a low surrounding fieldstone wall and a tiny offering temple, the king's pyramid was to stand alone, though the new pyramid was designed to be a little higher than previous ones, given that the project to complete the royal tomb complex required less than half the stone it had before. One would expect it to have been completed quickly. At all events, when the pyramid's cladding of smooth limestone was completed, work nonetheless continued, just as it had done at Djoser's tomb, and the pyramid was enlarged with the addition of another fine stone cladding and an additional step. Country life. All work on Sneferu's step pyramid seems to have stopped by the 14th year of his reign, that, at least, is suggested by the graffiti scribbled on many of its building blocks. And at exactly that same time, so a later text describes, too. Doorways were erected for King Sneferu as part of a palace that, in all probability, stood on the plain at Dahshur, some 25 miles to the north of Maidum and close by Saqqara, where Sneferu's workforce had started work upon a brand new pyramid. It is likely, therefore, that the several cemeteries of Sneferu's time which lie in the plain around the Maidum pyramid were established during the first 14 years of his rule, along with the splendid line of mastabas that lay along a ridge half a mile to its north, those standing in a similar relationship to the Maidum pyramid as did the tombs of Metjen and other nobles of the time too. Djoser's pyramid at Saqqara, these mastabas were far larger and had simpler chapels set into their eastern sides. Two of these tombs are of considerable importance for the later history of pharaonic culture. Not only did they hold works of extraordinary quality and originality in some of the finest draftsmanship to have survived from ancient Egypt, but they are the first known examples of a canon of tomb decoration that would be followed throughout the succeeding millennia by craftsmen working in cemeteries in every part of the ancient kingdom. The vast, unfinished mastaba that stands beside the Maidum pyramid, and which is still dwarfed by that colossal ruin, was probably one of the first of these great tombs to have been built. Made of enormous blocks of limestone, its superb burial crypt holds one of the oldest known granite sarcophagi in Egypt. Its chapel, however, is undecorated, the tomb anonymous. By contrast, the largest of these mastabas, and the first in the line that lies to the pyramid's north, was made, so its inscriptions tell, for a man and a woman, Nefermat and Atet, who were each provided with individual burial chambers in two deep shafts within the body of the mastaba, and with their own separate tomb chapels as well, which were set at the opposing ends of the mastaba's eastern face. The inscriptions in these chapels tell that Nefermat and Atet had children, and that Nefermat had been a royal prince and Sneferu's eldest son. It is convenient, then, to call the couple man and wife, though there is no known ceremony from any period of pharaonic history that equates to a modern wedding, and only in later periods do property settlements appear that, in detailing the disposal of the household goods of divorcing couples, imply that some formal state of espousal had been considered to exist between them. In similar fashion, Nefermat's often translated title of king's son does not necessarily imply that he was the physical offspring of the monarch, for some other courtiers of the time are described as having been a son of successive kings or, even, as eldest son of the king's own body. Better, perhaps, to think of such richly provided individuals as people who, unlike Metjen, held but few provincial titles and were members of the inner circle of the royal court. Whatever their DNA and surely not even the most ardent royalist would hold that such tests would invariably equate with the official versions of regal ancestry. Nefermat and Atet had shared a magnificent tomb, a solid rectangle, 420 feet long and some 30 feet high. It had walls of mud brick strengthened with lavish amounts of chopped straw, and had been entirely filled with huge quantities of liquid mud capped with several feet of gravel, plastered with fine-ground desert gesso that was so highly polished as to appear as straight and sharp as stone. The huge tomb would have shone as brightly in the yellow desert as the limestone of the nearby pyramid. In similarly extravagant fashion, the mastaba's two chapels were built from beautifully fitted blocks of fine white limestone weighing 10, 20, 30 tons apiece. Even in its ruin, it remains triumphantly impressive, the ground plans of its now vanished chapels marked by a few blocks of limestone lying at the bottom of two high gorges of eroded mud and dust that have been brought down from the broken mastaba that looms above. Once, though, the high paired walls of the two missing chapels had stood like sloping pylon doorways, their facades and inner surfaces covered in beautifully drawn registers filled with images of Nefermat and Atet going about their lives, accompanied by the members of their family in a menagerie of exotic animals. The great man carried in a palanquin to view the various work on the estates, plowing, slaughtering, butchering and boat building, the family hunting in the desert with their dogs, or fishing, fowling and trapping waterbirds in the marshes by the riverside. All those activities, in fact, that had since Naqadan times been recorded in a diversity of media and graves along the lower Nile, were given new life in these two chapels in a grand procession of lively images, laid out, row on row, on the high white walls. And at the same time, too, it is as if the narrative structures of later texts were being rehearsed within these measured pastorals, each one with its subject and its object, and with many of the images employed being identical to those of hieroglyphics. Just as in Metjen's chapel at Saqqara, the tomb owners are shown receiving trains of people carrying offerings to their tomb chapels, bringing geese and stall-kept animals from their farms, wine and figs from the kitchen gardens and the produce of the open fields, all borne on the heads of men and women from estates whose names are written out beside the bearers. Here as well are two of the couple's sons, the courtiers Seref Ka and Wem Ka, who are trapping ducks, whilst little children, other sons, perhaps, play with their pets, one of which, a grey baboon with the air of a naughty child, tweaks the feathers of a handsome crane, a cameo splendidly balanced on the opposing face of the other chapel by a line of desert foxes, the fine brown bushy tail of one of which is firmly grasped by the jaws of one of Nefermat's dappled hounds. Though these scenes are often described as reliefs, they are, in fact, a kind of cloisonné work, an outlandish technique in which each image, or even differently colored parts of a single image, are first drawn in silhouette on the flat surface of the stone, which is then excavated to a depth of an inch or so, before being infilled with hefty slabs of pure pigment. Today, with much of the pigment gone, the empty cloisons hold an inadvertent and confusing internal pattern of keyed chisel marks. What still makes these scenes remarkable, however, is that the cloisons' outline drawings are so fresh, so original and so filled with amused observation that, as well as fulfilling the requirements of a mortuary chapel, they hold genuine and fond observations of courtly country life. That the same scenes still hold a rare archaic grandeur, that newfound scale, which had emerged within the figurative arts in the time of Djoser and of Vizier, transforms their seemingly simple subject matter into a remarkable remembrance of things past. The idiosyncratic technique of setting slabs of pigment into the surface of a stone wall appears to have been unique to this tomb and may have been intended to serve a practical purpose. For the high pylons of the mastabas two stone chapels had once stood open and exposed upon a desert plain, a place where a thin layer of pigment painted in the usual way upon the wall would not have survived for very long, so that, like most of the designs that were painted on the exteriors of earlier mastabas, they would have been quickly lost. Indeed, a brief text written beside one of the figures of Nefermat describes the inlaid images as being made in a way which does not disappear, seems to address exactly that concern. The writer need not have worried. Just as Sneferu's first step pyramid had been covered with a second coat of stone, so many of the Maidum mastabas were similarly treated, their exteriors enlarged and beautifully plastered, once again, in fine white gesso. The new skin, though, would have buried the entrances to the two stone chapels under 12 feet of mud brick, and so a narrow corridor was made to connect them to the mastaba's new facade. And those two new narrow corridors were also covered in registers of decoration. That there had long been very skillful draftsmen working at the royal court is testified by the quality of Hesse-Rees reliefs, freed now from the usual constraints of working with sculptors and engravers. The master draftsmen came into their own in these two narrow corridors, painting directly onto the Smooth-surfaced, light gray walls and watery and fine-ground pigments, they show an easy skill, a balance of design and a clarity of vision that would seldom be matched in later ages. Here, once again, were images of Atet, Nefermat and members of their family, inspecting work on their estates and watching the lines of offerings arriving at the tomb. Amongst these scenes was one of the minor surviving masterpieces of Egyptian art, the famous fragments known as the Giza of Maidum, which, to a modern eye, are drawn with such bucolic brio that Metjen's phrase of very much still seems an apt description. Life and death at Maidum. In later years, the second enlargement of the mastaba of Nefermat and Atet was followed by a third, which, again, was precisely finished with a glass-like coat of desert gesso. Several of the other smaller tombs were similarly enlarged, once, twice, 3 times over, so that in 1871 the unveiling of these second skins, which had so long protected and obscured parts of the tomb chapel's interiors, provided one of Egyptology's periodic popular sensations. It would appear that in the autumn of that year, a certain Monsieur Vini of Alexandria had set a dozen laborers to digging in the drifted sand around the rows of Maidum's buried mastabas, searching, so he later said, for ancient animal bones. What Vini actually uncovered, however, was a high pillar of stone part of the portal of a tomb chapel, at which point the sheikh of the nearby village of Maidum had stopped his explorations and reported the discovery to the authorities in Cairo, even as the sheikh had sent his letter. However, the celebrations for the opening of the Suez Canal were concluding in Cairo, and the head of the government service des Antiquités, Auguste Mariette, was working at the Opera House, engaged in the final rehearsals for the Christmas Eve premiere of Verdi's Aida, an event for which he had written the preliminary libretto and designed the sets and costumes. Unable to attend in person, Mariette dispatched his assistant, Daninos Pasha, to Maidum, where he was met at the local railway station, so he later recalled, by 1,000 workmen, Mariette's habitual workforce, raised in corvée on the orders of the Khedive Ismail himself. In just 2 days, this enormous body of men had cleared the sand from the outlines of several of the northern mastabas, one of which, so the inscriptions on an outer wall of one of its 2 tomb chapels announced, had been made for another of Sneferu's sons, the Prince Rahotep and Nofret, his wife. Then came the discovery. As they continued digging, one of the workmen broke a small hole in a brick wall that had been built across the corridor of the prince's inner chapel. To everyone's amazement, Daninos Pasha and his race found themselves gazing through the darkness at 2 brightly painted statues of Rahotep and his wife, as large as life and sitting side by side, their crystal eyes flashing in the Egyptian sunlight, after an utter quietude of 4.5 millennia. That the scenes on the walls of the chapels of Rahotep and Nofret were more tightly organized and better balanced than those of Nefermat and Atet suggested. That their chapels had been made at a slightly later date, by which time the artists had abandoned the cloisonné technique and were cutting their images in raised relief, a technique that would remain the standard form of tomb chapel decoration for the following 5 centuries. It is the statues, though, set at the center of the chapel, that most impressed the visitors, not simply because of their uncanny eyes but also because, in their near-perfect state of preservation, they hold a genuinely lifelike presence. Unlike earlier statues, such as those of Djoser and his courtiers, those of Rahotep and Nofret have the same freshness as the domestic scenes on their chapel walls, and they appear as vulnerable human beings, so that, though their right arms are set across their chests in a traditional hieratic pose, that commanding action is transformed, so that it appears as a brave and touching human gesture, as these 2 people stare ahead, alive, together and alone. A great deal of traditional art historical study has been devoted to the school of sculptors that made these 2 exquisite works. Clearly, they are highly complex sculptures that, like others of their time, hold the aesthetics of the Nakwadan craft tradition, the lively silhouette, the synthetic rendering of natural Form, inside the newly emerged space frame of stone block sculpture. What is immediately engaging about these two stone sculptures, however, is their reality. Their clothes, their jewelry, her wig, his mustache, how the splayed toes of their feet have never been trapped inside a shoe, how the vigor of Rahotep's fist upon his chest is answered by the gentleness of the same pose in Nofret's statue, where her fingers press against her costume to bring out the curve of her breast. Not surprisingly, the pair created a sensation when they were transported to Cairo for exhibition in Egypt's National Museum, the first such in the Middle East. A photograph of a celebrated diva dressed in the costume of Aida was displayed next to Nofret, and it was remarked how very much alike they looked. This, the beginning of a long line of similar connections that are made down to this day, for Rahotep and his wife tend to provoke strong feelings of affinity. Along with the two statues, Mariette also ordered the removal of some fragile fragments of the tomb chapel's decorations, including the 6 fine geese from Atet's tomb chapel, which were dispatched, so a contemporary tourist remarked, to graze in Mariette's museum. And naturally the exhibition of those remarkable new finds provoked a steady stream of visitors to the desert of Maidum, and over the following years other sections of the paintings and reliefs were carved up and detached, and many of the cakes of color in the chapels of Nefermot and Atet were prized out of the walls. In December 1890, Flinders Petrie came to Maidum to survey and excavate the broken pyramid, and whilst he was engaged in one of his periodic battles with the Service d'Antiquité for permission to dig, he set about making facsimiles of the tomb chapel's remaining decorations, along with the hand copies of the hieroglyphs that Mariette had made when the chapels had been opened. These drawings are the only record of the original positions of the fragments that survive. 20 years later, with the Maidum paintings and reliefs still suffering depredation, the authorities of the Service d'Antiquité invited Petrie to return to Maidum and dismantle the tomb chapels, whose great stones would then be divided up, half to the Cairo Museum, and half to Petrie's patrons. So the beauteous chapels of Rahotep and Nofret, Nefermot and Atet are no more, their fragments, apart from those that were part reassembled in Cairo, scattered in museums throughout the West, in Oxford and Cambridge, in New York and Boston, in Munich and London, Liverpool and Bristol, in Brussels and Chicago, Philadelphia, and Copenhagen. The state in life and death. The traditional explanation of such scenes as were laid out in the tomb chapels of Nefermot and Atet and Rahotep and Nofret is that the ancient Egyptians believed them to be magical, that the lines of offering bearers were carrying substitutes for the real provisions that were traditionally offered to the spirits of the people in the tomb, and that the scenes of daily life were constructed so that their spirits could visit and enjoy the world again. Such explanations, of course, would be offensive were they employed to explain the impulses that lead modern governments to maintain war cemeteries, or the sentiments involved in setting toys or flowers on a family grave, activities which are not dissimilar to some of those performed in the chapels of the Maidum mastabas, both through their paintings and by the staffs of professionals who lived close by and were supported, as was the case at Metjen's tomb, by the produce of an estate that had been entailed for those particular purposes by the tomb's owners during their own lifetimes. Another explanation that goes some way to explain the intensity and the huge amounts of time and labor expended on these decorated tombs is that their owners wished to celebrate their lives in images and inscriptions while they were still alive, that they represent, therefore, the beginnings of the construction of personal identity in the people of the pharaonic court. And indeed, to modern eyes, the reliefs of Hesi-Re or the statues of Nofret and Rahotep have an air of individuality about them that encourages us to speculate about their lives and personal biographies. Yet for the most part, the scenes in these tombs will be repeated over and over again, down through the ages, so that they quickly became generic and repetitive, while the texts that will accompany them will usually hold little more than the names of the tomb's intended occupants, and those of some of their family members, and lists of offerings and courtly designations. It would appear, therefore, that with their leisure descriptions of the richness and continuity of courtly life, and the unblinking equanimity with which both their text and images confront life and death, the tomb chapel's decorations are something more than magic images or brief attempts at describing the qualities of individuals. What these tomb chapels actually provide are confident descriptions of an ordered and secure society, in order to contain the courtiers in life and death. In order, too, that in real life, in Sneferu's day, was held within the endless lines of stone haulers working at the royal pyramid, and also in the tomb chapels of his nobles, in images of lines of offerers and offerings. Such chapels are, therefore, essentially an extension of the Nakwadan practices of burial, a part of a dialogue of care between the living and the dead that maintain their joint community, and also a kind of afterlife. Offering at the tomb, of course, a tithing of the living by the dead, had been undertaken since Badarian times. By Sneferu's day, however, the notion had taken the essential form of an image of a well-dressed courtier, sitting on a fine-made chair, beside a table stacked with loaves of bread, with both those images precisely set within a well-proportioned panel whose empty spaces were entirely filled with lists of offerings of food and linen. That such panels were often placed at the center of the tomb chapel, above an offering slab and in full view of the entrance doorway, shows how the arrangements for the noble dead echoed the order of the living kingdom, how the vigorous systems of supply, whose energy and prosperity were enabling the construction of great pyramids, also sustained the households of the courtiers in life and death. That, too, is the underlying meaning of the hieroglyphic formula, the so-called Hetepti that, since the time of Metjen, had accompanied such lists of offerings, and which is traditionally translated as a boon that the king gives. Not that this need imply that the kings sent real food to physically feed the spirits of the noble dead, but that the existence of the tombs themselves, their imported stone, their situation in the royal cemeteries, the employment of the finest craftsmen of the royal court to work on their offering chapels, and the royal guarantee underlying the entailment of land to support continued offerings at the tomb, were all products of the good order of the living state, and that, quite literally, was a boon provided by the kings, for that office was the embodiment, the personification, of the state itself. So these first decorated tomb chapels were filled with images and sentiments of the everyday, rendered as aspects of the living state, that state which through the office of the king, the arbiter of life and death, the conduit between the living and the dead, extended to the realms of death. Offering at the pyramid. After copying the scenes in the courtiers' tomb chapels and securing a license to excavate at Maidum, Petrie put his workforce to digging into the mounds of chip and dust that roll around the oddly devastated pyramid, a product of stone robbers in collapse, with the aim of discovering the identity of its owner, which was not then known. After several weeks of hard and largely fruitless labor, he then bit the bullet and dug directly into the huge mound at the center of the pyramid's east face where, experience had told him, a royal temple might have stood. And there it was that, after further weeks of dust storms and rock falls, at the bottom of a loose and dangerous cutting which by this time would have held 2 or 3 good-sized London houses, he came down upon the roof of a small, slope-sided building. Unfortunately, the little temple, though as sturdy as a pillbox, was entirely uninscribed. Even the pair of splendid 14 feet high stelae that still stood beside it, and which resembled some of those put up in the Abydis cemeteries, were completely blank. This disappointment was part redeemed, however, by the graffiti of some pharaonic tourists who had visited the temple 12 centuries after the pyramid's construction and had affably recorded in inky hieroglyphs how very pleased they had been to visit the very great pyramid of King Sneferu, built of blocks of limestone weighing 20 to 30 tons, the little temple's gigantic roofing blocks had protected its interior during the pyramid's disastrous collapses, most of which had occurred in the generations after the ancient scribes had written their graffiti. A simple chicane like those that had been built in front of some of the shrines of Djoser's great enclosure had led those visitors up to a small door that had opened into a tiny courtyard, whose back wall was the dizzily sloping surface of the rising pyramid. And there, between the feet of the two high-standing stelae, lay the focus of this tough little monument, a great stone offering altar, shaped like the Hetep hieroglyph, a formal image of a loaf of bread set on a papyrus mat. Kings, of course, had always received offerings at their tombs. Unlike the offering chapels in the nearby courtiers' tombs, however, and indeed unlike all the earlier royal monuments, this royal offering temple had been connected to a great long causeway lined with blocks of stone that had run down from the pyramid to the edge of the cultivated land. Here, presumably, there had been a dockside, with a canal linked to the Nile and, thus, to all of living Egypt. When Sneferu was alive, his workforce had shipped building blocks from distant quarries along the river and up canals and, finally, slid them up great building ramps onto his rising pyramid. So too, this causeway made architectural provision for lines of offerers to follow exactly that same progress, to bring produce from the royal estates up and down the lower Nile to the offering slab. Within the little temple at the pyramid, the causeway and the tiny temple, a stone synopsis of the state's essential systems. Annals be modern standards, the monuments of Djoser and Sneferu hold silent histories of their own. Their construction was so large, so all-consuming for the state that Maidum, that their manufacture had been far and away the major happening of their times. And yet, beyond the presence of their monuments, there is scarcely any contemporary record of the lives of the kings whose names they bear. 3 centuries later, however, in the 6th dynasty, some scribes compiled an elaborate record of that period. The oldest known account of the reigns of the early kings, it was essentially a kind of diary, an annual court circular that in gnomic phrases listed some of the activities of the court. Small parts of that record survive in the form of some broken and fragmentary inscribed stones known as the Annals, the most celebrated piece of which is the so-called Palermo stone, a portentous slab of engraved basalt. Shipped, so it appears, from Memphis in the 18th century and marooned today in a Sicilian museum, along with a number of similar though smaller pieces housed in museums in London and Cairo. These fragments seem to have come from a single 6-foot slab that might once have formed part of a sarcophagus, lightly tapped in tiny rows of hieroglyphs on both sides of the slab's 2 shining faces. The annals were set within the lines of an accounting grid that, in a deliberately archizing manner, gives them the appearance of rows of First Dynasty ivory picture plaques, with the individual boxes measuring out the years of each king's reign. Though most of the great stone slab is lost, the grid had been accurately divided, so it may be reasonably estimated that it had once held the names of at least 100 prehistoric rulers and that it had also provided a calendar of the reigns of the first 5 dynasties of kings, starting with a list of odd-sounding names of otherwise unrecorded rulers. The text first took the readers back to the beginning and then to the times of Manetho's first dynasty, where, though the kings' names are lost, it yet records the years when the gods were born and worshipped, when statues were first made, and when palaces and temples were measured out upon the earth. At the same time, it also tells of royal rounds of offering and tithing, the years when cattle, gold and people were counted and recorded, records similar in many ways to those in the descriptions copied from the Egyptiaka. And always and inevitably, these little records are literally underpinned by rows of hieroglyphic numbers giving the exact height of the annual inundation of the Nile, the foundation of state wealth, just as they had done with ancient texts from Herodotus to the Old Testament. Traditional historians generally divided the surviving texts of the Annals into those that appear probable and those that seem improbable, plucking the real from the mythical, like plums from a pudding, taken all together. However, as the ancient scribes had done, the broken fragments carefully record that a stone temple had been erected long before King Djoser's time when men himself, or perhaps a statue of that god? Dash had been born. The texts then go on to tell us, though here there is a considerable gap in the surviving record, that, in the 2-year period between the 12th and 14th years of Sneferu's reign, the king had brought thousands of people and great herds of cattle from the south, that a royal palace was erected, and that the shipyards were building dozens of boats and barges, some of which were 100 cubits, over 170 feet, in length. This is information that, as far as the reign of Sneferu is concerned, describes valid if not essential components of the projects in which, so modern archaeology informs us, King Sneferu's court was then engaged, yet which the Annals never mention, the construction of the king's new pyramids. Here, then, is early evidence of the opening of the gulf between the modern view of history and that held in the majority of the surviving records of pharaonic culture. For there are no contemporary records that in any way describe the creation of the early pyramids, nor does the memory of their manufacture, or even a notice of their enduring presence in the Memphis landscape, impinge on the records of their time, nor, indeed, of any later ages. It is as if the ancient culture had lived entirely in the present, that the list of kings compiled in the first dynasty had not been made for historical purposes at all, but to define the continuing office of kingship of itself. In similar fashion, the Annals only record events outside the usual rhythms of the court's routine, the exact height of the annual flood, the birth of gods in the year of a temple's founding, events that were unique. In such a world, pyramids and pyramid making would not have been regarded as a part of history, not as monuments to memorialize the lives of individual kings, for the work of their construction was part of the daily and yearly processes of the living state. Building, setting stone on stone and making pyramids, is hardly a symbolic enterprise. In similar fashion, the people of the Lower Nile had long since understood that their communities were sustained by economy and practicality. And the Nakwadans, whose craftsmen had carefully observed and classified their bountiful environment, had ordered their settlements in the belief that the survival of the community of both the living and the dead was dependent on those same processes. After 3 centuries of kingship in the royal court, after 3 centuries of such continuous change that Jet's little comb with its engraving of a model universe seems more like a proposition than a settled statement of ideology, the royal court had gathered and defined the vital elements of their culture at the royal pyramids in precisely the same way as their Nakwadan predecessors had done, by extending the processes of burial. Now, though, the scale of these processes of definition had entirely changed so that, in the generations after Dahshur, as an ever-enlarging state machine quarried and laid blocks of stone at ever greater rates, there was a delirium of building. 29. A building passion. Sneferu at Dahshur, 2600 to 2575 BC. The real adventure of Sneferu's reign began in its 14th year when, as the Palermo stone helpfully records, the gates of a royal residence were erected and, as the graffiti and statistics of Sneferu's building works both show, Sneferu's pyramid makers had started the construction of the first of the pyramids that would be built on the plain at Dahshur. It would appear, therefore, that those 2 new gates, one facing north towards the delta and the other towards the south, and the Nile Valley, were the entrances of a royal palace, and that the court had moved from Maidum back to Dahshur close by Saqqara, where Sneferu's predecessor, Huni, may also have been buried. The work of building Sneferu's 2 pyramids at Dahshur was, and yet remains, an unparalleled human labor, and the amounts of stone and ambition that were required, gargantuan. Whereas the stepped pyramid at Maidum had been similar in size in both its phases to the earlier stepped pyramids, the 2 monuments built by Sneferu at Dahshur, one following the other, were 3 and 5 times larger than their predecessors, so that, for their completion whilst the king yet lived, the labor force must on occasion have been tripled in its size. And when the work was at its height, those building programs would have engaged some 25,000 workers, more than 10% of the adult male workforce in the kingdom and a depletion that, in an agrarian society in less fertile climates and in less ordered states, would have had a similar effect to that of a medieval plague. Nor were those two pyramids the ending of the work. Upon completing that architectural extravaganza, the royal workforce returned to Maidum, where Atagan enlarged the baselines of Sneferu's stepped pyramid and smoothed out its sides, transforming it into the first classically proportioned pyramid. A history in stone. Like all the other early pharaohs, Sneferu, the man himself, has virtually disappeared. Only spare and eroded images of him have survived, and certainly we have no idea of his role in the making of his pyramids, nothing beyond the graffiti on some of the blocks which record the time they were either quarried or set up on a pyramid. One thing, though, is sure, just like the earlier monuments of Djoser, Sneferu's three great pyramids are products of a lengthy reign. And Sneferu certainly reigned for a very long time, present estimates ranging between 23 and 46 years. A great part of the problem of calculating the length of Sneferu's reign more precisely is that the numbers of the stone workers' graffiti may not record the years of Sneferu's rule at all, but those of a biennial cattle count. Recent evidence, however, has shown that in later reigns the cattle count occurred more frequently, though it is not yet clear whether this was also true in Sneferu's time. The colossal work of pyramid construction, however, would tend to indicate that it was not, for even with a biennial cattle count, which would allow Sneferu a full 46 years, this would have made the building of his second pyramid at Dahshur a 10-year sprint which, in the first years of construction, for example, would have required the setting of 152.5-ton limestone blocks up onto the pyramid in each hour of every working day. If a cattle count had taken place in every year of Sneferu's reign, therefore, the pyramid's 3.8 million tons of stone would have had to have been laid in half the time, a work that, even if conditions at the site could have provided the physical space for such a large labor force, would have required the labors of a quarter of the adult male population which, given the resources of the kingdom, would have been economically unsustainable. Thus, I have based my estimates of the length of Sneferu's building works on a reign of 46 years, a time frame that sets the beginning of his second Dahshur pyramid around the 30th year of his rule. At some 720 feet along its baselines and almost 345 feet high, Sneferu's second pyramid at Dahshur would have been far larger than anything ever built before. The decision to build it at such an extraordinary rate, therefore, represents a change of gear in the mechanisms of the pharaonic state, another fundamental change following the introduction of stone block building in the reign of Djoser that saw the state's available resources enlarged fivefold in 50 years. In great part, this extraordinary change of scale and state resources was based on practical considerations, for the first pyramid that Sneferu's work gangs began to build at Dahshur had become so unstable during its construction that it was abandoned. Unfortunately, the conservative methods of the court builders had led them to start work at Dahshur in the same way that, some 50 years before, King Djoser's craftsmen had started building pyramids, by laying out the baselines directly on the desert, in a line of cut stone blocks bedded in a little sand. At Saqqara, the weight of Djoser's pyramid, a structure a quarter of the size of Sneferu's new pyramid, had been supported by the desert's underling rock. At Maidum as well, a prehistoric riverbed of cemented clay and gravel still holds that pyramid in an equally firm fashion. At Dahshur, however, the underlying geology of the part of the plain they chose for the new pyramid was erratic and unreliable, so that, as it had begun to rise in more than 1 million tons of rock, the largest gathering of cut stone that the world had ever seen was set onto its shallow baselines, it began to sink unevenly, and twist. Adding further to its woes, the failing pyramid had been planned differently from all the others. It was, for example, to have been the first smooth-sided pyramid, a form derived, perhaps, from the building methods employed at the Maidum pyramid, which, judging by the appearance of its ruin, had been erected by adding a series of stepped enlargements onto a smooth-sided central core. At the same time, the failing pyramid had also been set to rise at a far steeper angle than any other pyramid, so that, had it been completed, it would have stood at an unprecedented height of 400 feet. Even had the ground beneath been stable, the pressure on its baselines would have been tremendous. Unremittingly, as the building blocks were piled up, day on day, ton by ton, they began to crack and shift until the entire structure was so unstable that the burial chamber and other rooms set at the center of the pyramid had to be part filled with stacks of stone and wooden buttresses, some of which are still in place today. Nothing, though, could stabilize the structure, and, after 15 years of labor, Sneferu's builders stopped piling further blocks of stone onto the failing pyramid. When the work was at its height, the pyramid makers had been quarrying and transporting, cutting, hauling and setting well over 1,002.5 ton blocks of limestone every working day on this pyramid. What a disaster, then! With stone blocks arriving at Dahshur at such a rate, that the pyramid on which they were being in place was sinking and twisting ever further under their accumulating weight. A practical solution, but only in the modern meaning of that term, would have been to return the king to Maidum for burial within his first built pyramid. Yet the pyramid makers, or at least the officers of Sneferu's court who controlled that masterpiece of Bronze Age organization, did not stop the state building machine, but simply moved the location of its stone deliveries a mile to the north and started the construction of another and yet larger pyramid. Before the age of pyramids, the principal function of the court and king had been the provisioning of the living court at Memphis and the production of stone bases. Pyramid building, however, the expanded networks of the state, its colonies and quarries, its shipyards and storage enclosures, its mines and estates, had become the main factor of the enlarging prosperity of the living state. So, just as the labor of pyramid making had been transferred from Maidum to Dahshur with the court, the work of Sneferu's pyramid makers had not stopped. When the pyramid on which they were working could not sustain more stone, the work of pyramid making only stopped. Indeed, when a pharaoh died, not a single unfinished pyramid is known to have been started by one pharaoh and finished by another. A new one was begun with the beginning of each new reign, a procedure that literally regathered the resources and organization of the state together around the offices of the new king. So, in the 30th year of Sneferu's rule, after abandoning the failing and half-finished pyramid, the royal workforce had started on another. With generations of experience, their supply lines already up and running, the masons building the largest stone block buildings in the world with the simplest of equipment. This was a state machine the like of which the world, let alone the lower valley of the Nile, had never seen before. Employing, in all probability, gangs of between 10 and 20 men, a practical number of people for working on the pyramid standard 2.5-ton limestone block stash. Thousands of corpsmen were engaged in extracting and shaping blocks of stone and hauling them down ramps onto the dockside so that they could be transported in a fleet of boats to Dahshur, where thousands more men were employed in hauling the blocks up other ramps and finally onto the new pyramid, where, under the eyes of master craftsmen and with an extraordinary care, they were set into position. Thousands upon thousands of huts, compounds, and settlements must have been scattered in the fields and deserts all around the Dahshur plain so that, together with the royal residence, they would have made a sort of city. Building the machine, though its four sides had been bravely and ambitiously set at the unprecedented length of over 700 feet, the new pyramid at Dahshur had been designed to rise at a far lower slope than its failed neighbor, so the mass and the pressure on its baselines were considerably reduced. The sheer size of the new pyramid's footprint, however, meant that the tonnage of quarried stone required for its completion was more than 1.5 times that of the earlier one. At previous work rates, therefore, the new planned pyramid would have taken some 30 years to finish, and this at a time when Sneferu had already spent a similar length of time upon the throne and was, by ancient standards, an old man. Yet, as its graffiti show, the vast new pyramid, known now as the Red Pyramid Dash, appears to have been built in less than 11 years, which means that the size of the royal workforce was approximately tripled. Given their geometric regularity, the mathematics are inevitable, though appearing today as if the work of their building had just begun. Several unfinished pyramids actually hold half the stone of a completed one. For the low-angled Red Pyramid to have been finished in less than 11 years, half of its stone would have had to have been laid by the second year of its construction. And in those early years, of course, when the pyramid was at its widest, many gangs could have worked side by side, but their numbers would, perforce, have tapered with the pyramid itself, as the work continued. Sneferu's workforce, therefore, had varied greatly in its size throughout his reign. 7 times more people would have been required during the first years of the building of his 3 main pyramid projects than at their ending. In this economy, therefore, where large labor forces were erratically employed, the presence of a permanent core community of craftsmen would have been essential, for pyramid making requires extraordinary skills. A nucleus, it may be estimated, of around 5,000 people, a community with generational experience in such tasks, employed from the beginning to the ending of the work. This core group would have provided each new king with the expertise to lay out a new pyramid's baselines with extraordinary precision, to select and organize suitable quarries from which to bring the stone, to construct the building ramps, to plan and to construct the pyramid's internal corridors and chambers, and to ensure that the building rose up straight and true until the capstone was put into position. It is probably no accident that this estimate of 5,000 pyramid makers is similar to the number of craftsmen, so it has been calculated, that were working in the quartz stone vase industry before the reign of Dahshur. It is likely, therefore, that the core workforce of pyramid makers were the descendants of the same community of craftsmen that, half a century before, in Dahshur's time, had made the switch from stone vases to stone block buildings, and whose labors and aesthetics had guided stone architecture from its beginnings. This core of craftsmen, directly subsidized by the state systems of supply, was in effect part of the royal court, and down through the following millennia would cultivate and maintain its unique cultural identity, running the machine. In the last decade of Sneferu's lengthy reign, as work on the Red Pyramid was nearing its completion, the state machine continued quarrying and transporting stone at such a rate that, in those last few years, almost a quarter of all the building blocks that were used in Sneferu's reign, a further 2 million tons of them, were quarried, transported and emplaced throughout pharaonic history. Such unusually lengthy reigns as those of Sneferu and Dahshur were often periods of architectural innovation, periods, that is, when the standard monuments of royalty had been built, yet the royal workforce was still cutting and transporting stone. Thus, at a time late in Sneferu's reign, both the failed pyramid at Dahshur and Sneferu's pyramid at Maidum were provided with small temples on their eastern sides. Both these temples were approached through chicanes and both had 2 large offering stones set between a pair of enormous stelae. In all likelihood, therefore, these 2 pyramids had been integrated, along with the Pyramid of Sela and the diadem of other little pyramids strung out along the valley of the Nile, into the cult that had been created around the offices of the king and the court systems of collection and supply. At Dahshur, at the same time, an expert eye was also cast over the failed pyramid, trained now by a further furious decade of experience in pyramid making, a decade in which the techniques of every part of pyramid making, from lime burning to stone setting, had entirely changed. The masons first built a girdle of large and fine cut blocks of the densest limestone around the bottom of the failed pyramid, and then, extravagantly, they capped the unfinished pyramid with another, pitched at a lower angle. Even as they laid new blocks upon the failed pyramid, it had begun to twist and move again, and huge fresh cracks appeared. Now, though, the pyramid makers dealt with every wrench and subsidence as it occurred, setting new building lines and refitting blocks of stone. And in so doing, they built a series of controlled tensions into the rising monument, so that the bent pyramid, as it is now known, is the strongest and best preserved of all the pyramids of Egypt. In those same years, the pyramid makers went back to Maidum, and there as well, they built a girdling wall around the base of the old pyramid, smoothed out its stepped sides and raised its apex to a new height. Sneferu's extraordinary pyramid building machine, indeed, just kept on working, until the old king died, and was buried, in all probability, at Dahshur inside the Red Pyramid, which yet remains the second largest pyramid that the Egyptians would ever build. 2. Khufu, his successor, the old king had bequeathed a workforce and a statewide building machine such as the world had never known. And at the same time, the court had gained that cultural confidence which would become an indelible ingredient of the later state. 30. Making the gods. Deity at Dahshur, 2600 to 2575 BC. In the winter of 1951, Ahmed Fakhri, a professor at the University of Cairo, undertook the clearance of a causeway at Dahshur which, in the manner of the causeway of the Maidum pyramid, had run down from the bent pyramid towards the cultivation, and at its end, almost half a mile from the pyramid itself, he found the ruins of a fine stone building that had been erected as a place of offering, as a focus of a cult of King Sneferu which had continued for a millennium and more. The detritus of generations of the cult's officials, statues, stelae, offering tables, family memorials, seals and document boxes, lay all round it in the sand. Before it had been stripped to its foundations and the better part of its stonework rendered into quicklime in a nearby kiln, the cult temple had been a handsome structure, almost 160 feet long, made in the simple form of a large, plain-sided mastaba with gently sloping walls. Passing from the causeway through a pair of wooden doors, a single entrance at the center of its eastern side had given access to a central corridor, a passageway set between 4 storerooms, which had opened into a large bright courtyard. Here, in the shadows at the far end, behind 2 rows of 4 square pillars, had stood 6 sleek statues of King Sneferu, each one standing high in its own niche. As the surviving fragments showed, the temple's interior had been covered in reliefs, the oldest known decorated temple to have survived from ancient Egypt, which had been cut in the same strong and lively manner as those within the near-contemporary tomb chapels of Metjen at Saqqara and Rahotep in Nofret. At Maidum, the same fragments also showed that some of the subject matter of reliefs had been similar to that of the nobles' tomb chapels, the king overseeing the rearing of exotic and domesticated animals, holding audience and receiving offerings, and there were some of the same scenes, as well, as those set down in earlier centuries on picture plaques and mace heads. The only intact reliefs that Fakhri found in their original positions were some rows of offering bearers carved in nicely measured registers along the half-broken walls of the corridor which had given access to the courtyard and the shrines. Listed, identified and quantified, they held dozens of images of women who, on one wall, had been carrying provisions from Sneferu's estates in the Nile Valley and, on the other, from his estates in the Delta. The destination of these offerings, which was indicated by the direction of the offerer's procession, had been the life-size statues of King Sneferu in the shadowed niches at the end of the open court. Though their surfaces had been damaged by the eruption of the limestone's natural salts, and some of their eyes had been plucked out, 2 of these 6 figures had yet survived relatively intact, along with fragments of the others, over life-sized, idealized images of a calm young king that had impassively overseen generations of offerings by the resident ritualists, whose relics Fakhri had found scattered round the temple. The temple's continuing endowment, so these relics told, had been sustained to be the produce of some of Sneferu's estates, an arrangement that a later pharaoh had reaffirmed in a decree which had been carved in stone and set up beside the temple. In such documents, the administrators of the cult are usually described as the servants of the god, or, as it is frequently translated, as temple priests. In hieroglyphic writing, however, the term typically employs the netter sign, an enigmatic image of a flag flying from a decorated stick, which, as we have already seen, is usually taken to signify a god yet which first appeared as part of the name of an early king, and which in the times before King Sneferu may equally well have signified an ancestor or grave, or indeed a plot of land or shrine that held a special power. What precise significance the sign may have held for Sneferu's contemporaries, therefore, is not known. It is highly unlikely, however, that it had simply signified those well-known gods that, in the popular imagination, indiscriminately inhabit all periods of ancient Egypt. For in this modest temple, amongst the innumerable fragments of relief, we found some of the oldest known images of the pharaonic gods in the form of human figures or, in the case of several of them, in that typical ancient Egyptian combination of later times, of a human body with the head of a lion, a jackal or another animal, in the image of the king. Seen now, in drawings made from reconstructions of the gathered fragments of relief, some of the most celebrated of the pharaonic gods, some of which are named and others whose images are but preserved in tiny fragments, make their first appearance in this temple, one at a time. Several of them were shown embracing Sneferu in the manner of thousands of later royal reliefs. Others were in yet closer contact with the king, nose to nose and face to face with Pharaoh. And the encounter holds remarkable intensity, as if the single images of Hesi or Djoser that are so filled with pulse and sentience had suddenly been placed in intimate contact with another similar being. Earlier examples of images of these gods in human or semi-human form are very rare. In a unique relief that came onto the antiquities market in the 1960s, Sneferu's predecessor, Huni, is shown being embraced by a god who is drawn as a man with the head of a hawk and is identified as Horus. A single limestone slab, less than 2 feet high, this remarkable relief was carved in a gentler style than those of the time of Sneferu. It is more similar, indeed, to Djoser's 6 reliefs, and, like those earlier works, may have been set close to the royal burial. Older still, the only other unambiguous early image of a god in human form that is known to have survived was sculpted on a broken door jamb, from a mud brick building which had been set up at Hierakonpolis for Khase-Kamoy, Djoser's predecessor, decorated with a variety of odd and complex scenes that appear to hold several images of the king posed in the usual manner. In one of them, though they are all very damaged, he appears to be accompanied by a woman engaged in marking out a plot of land and who carries the hieroglyphic attributes of the goddess Seshet. In later ages, Seshet is similarly pictured helping the king found temples by marking out plots of land. Appropriately, given the insistent harmonies of pharaonic architecture, Seshet will also be associated with counting and with mathematics, qualities that are present in the subtle symmetries of Sneferu's limestone temple, where she had also once appeared. On the assumption that the ancient Egyptian gods hailed from a savage prehistoric past, their ancestry, as we have seen, used to be traced back to the earliest occurrences of some of the attributes with which they became associated. Those signs that originated deep in Nakwadan times. Similarly, the graphic conventions of drawing human figures with the heads of animals was sometimes said to have been derived from masks such as had been worn in settlements along the lower Nile since early prehistoric times. And, as it is difficult for many Westerners to imagine gods without written explanations and accompanying stories, so the lost histories of these faux archaic deities were unthinkingly ascribed to a lost oral tradition. There is no evidence, however, that the human-figured gods in Sneferu's temple were the products of such Fraserian imaginings? Quite the reverse, in fact. Rather than being personifications of primitive powers or phonic deities, these gods are newly made, as the rows of offerers in the tombs of Djoser's courtiers most elegantly demonstrate the graphic device of personification used to create these novel deities have been employed to identify other aspects of the state for at least the previous half-century. In Sneferu's Dahshur temple, the brief written text which accompany these standard offering figures are now a major source of information about the order of King Sneferu's state, for they record the names of the estates and the types of goods that they produced. These estates are identified by the nomes in which they were situated, many of which, though not all of them, make their first known appearance beside the rows of offering figures in Sneferu's temple. The figures and the text together, therefore, hold a large part of the early history of the royal estates and also of temple endowments. Gathered thus, from mud ceilings, a few tomb chapels and the fragmented reliefs of Sneferu's temple, the emerging bureaucratic structures of King Sneferu's state are still little understood. Nonetheless, it is clear that, in that strange elusive age, in the dramatic half-century between the death of Dahshur and the reign of Sneferu, the kingdom was divided and subdivided and came into its own. Its farmlands and estates were identified, listed and personified along with other equally vital yet less easily defined aspects of the kingdom such as the voluptuous plenty of the inundation, of wild rush, marsh and water, whose small anonymous personifications make their appearance in the broken reliefs of Sneferu's temple as a row of fat, blue-painted male figures. Early Egyptologists had identified these little chaps, a common feature of temple decoration throughout pharaonic history, as Nile gods, a term that fell out of fashion when it was recognized that these gynecomastic figures were personifications of abundance and fertility, rather than of the Nile itself. The first age of pyramid building, the half-century from Dahshur to Sneferu had seen an intellectual revolution conducted in architecture and stone images. And part of that took place within this limestone temple, with the dust of pyramid making rising from the desert plain behind them, as some of Sneferu's courtiers and craftsmen created images personifying the various aspects of the kingdom, from the rhythms of the river and the order of the state to the gods themselves, and all of them identified, drawn and situated as elements of the economic engine, natural and man-made, that would fuel the pharaonic state till its ending. What, if anything, the individual gods gathered in this temple may specifically have personified, however, is not clear. Certainly, these images of Seshet, Men, and Ptah, and many others, did not embody the descriptions of the gods listed in dictionaries of ancient Egypt, those elderly Victorian deities who were described as the gods of Memphis or of mathematics, of beer or craftsmen, of foreigners and childbirth, and all the other things that at one time or another their images may have accompanied or embodied. These have been diligently collected from the accumulated faith of ages in a manner that has been described as showing the impatient objectivity of the lepidopterist, who aesthetically but terminally arranges his creatures, in those famous glass boxes which might look instructive but convey little about the splendor of the living being. These figures, however, are entirely different. These scraps from Sneferu's temple are the first known appearances of those mysterious deities that generations of pharaonic scribes will name in their writings throughout the following millennia. Sneferu's gods, however, were created in a pre-literary environment, one in which the manipulation of stone, wood and pigment was a prime mover in the processes of human thought. They could not, therefore, have started life as illustrations to a written literature, so it is hardly likely that they were born of illogical endeavor. It is precisely because these images were not designed to symbolize abstract ideas and were made in absolute conformity to the craftsman's rules of image making, that any intellectual processes that may have been involved in their creation have been effectively disguised. What is left, however, is something of the environment in which they were created, their time and place, that dramatic point in time when work on Sneferu's pyramids was coming to its conclusion, an age that had seen an unprecedented mass of humanity linked in a single purpose, building for the king who was the center of the state, the sustainer of its order. and the prosperity of the court. Here, then, the relief artists drew out the vital qualities of the state machine in human form and, in so doing, they created some of the oldest known images of the pharaonic gods. A clue to the origins of these gods and to their roles in Sneferu's state is held in some of the images that were set on the rows of columns that shadowed the statues of the royal cult, images of Sneferu carrying a mason stick, those archetypal tools of slaughter that, as the fundamental tools of offering and kingship, had long served as the keys to another world. These images of the king had marked the place in Sneferu's temple where, behind the columns, in the shadows, offerings were made, 10 close-set pillars, demarcating the edges of the offering place, a zone at the edge of this world and the next, where the image of the king, cast in his roles as the receiver of offerings in the conduit between life and death, would be particularly appropriate. All the architecture of the temple, the dark corridor beyond the entrance, the open court, the shaded columns, the royal statues and the altars, lead to a powerful place set between this world and the next, a zone that is precisely described as sacred and thus holds more than words within it. Here, within the temple, above the rows of offering bearers in the blue fertility figures, were also carved and painted images of the gods. Given human or quasi-human form, they appear, as did the figures of estates in abundance, as personifications. Unlike those other figures, however, the gods are personifications based on the images of the king. They stood in close physical proximity to Sneferu and they were drawn in some of the same poses, with sesame build and at exactly the same height. And they embraced the figure of the king as he enters into the temple, into that zone between this world and the next, as if they were inducting him through the looking glass of the offering altar into a world beyond, the place of kings. In the half-century since Djoser's day, the vision of the court had shifted. Rather than reproducing the buildings of the living kingdom in stone, as Djoser's craftsmen had once done, Sneferu's temple, with its king and gods and plentiful estates, held images of the entirety of the pharaonic state. And the center of that ordered imagery was the figure of the pharaoh. In sheer economic terms, in pyramids and palaces, in estates and offering temples, the king took up far more of the state's resources than the newly envisaged deities who embraced him in the shadows of his temple. Throughout pharaonic history, indeed, images of gods will usually be shown in the company of kings. That is their place. As many later temple texts describe, the royal state was a precondition of their presence, for it is the king who builds the houses of the gods, so that they may dwell within his kingdom. And at the same time that the gods appear, the image of the king within the order of the state visibly changes. For the images of the gods have given a new and powerful physical dimension to the sacred, rather than the indistinct sanctity of the earlier shrines. The human figures of the gods have brought air and life and space with them, another world. And simultaneously, as he is set into their company in the chapels and in temples in which offerings are made, the office of the king, the arbiter of life and death on earth, has also changed. At this same time, the royal name is isolated from all others, its hieroglyphs circumscribed inside an oval ring, the so-called cartouche, which is at one and the same time an elongated chin sign, used to describe the eternal circuit of the sun, and also a ring of the multi-stranded rope employed by the pyramid stone hauling gangs. Though it had made its first appearance in earlier reigns, from the time of Sneferu the cartouche is regularly used to frame the names of kings, and its distinctive form will serve to highlight the royal donation that is announced in the offering chapels of the nobles' tombs. Nor need this continuing definition of the office of the pharaoh have been the cunning plan of a propagandizing dictator, as tradition once explained. Nor, indeed, need it have been the product of someone who believed himself to be divine or even possessed of the divine rights of a Baroque king. The true story is one of continuing inventiveness and change, and once again it is to be found within the surviving architecture. From one project to the next, the early pyramids show an utter lack of standardization. Each one was constructed in a different way, and just as they were not built by laborers employing primitive versions of modern equipment, so neither were they built by rule and rote, or driven by principles of practicality or modern economics. Even the ramps up which the stones were hauled onto the early pyramids, several of which still survive, show different methods of construction and design. The shapes and sizes of the pyramid's buildings blocks were often changed, sometimes during the course of building a single pyramid, and, in similar manner, the finishing of the various pyramids' exteriors shows the use of a wide range of implements and diverse techniques, with the success and failure of their half-dozen projects. However, Sneferu's stone workers learned that better finished stones were more stable than rough blocks, learned, too, how carefully fired plaster was more suited for the tasks that it had to perform than the raw material, learned also how to triple a workforce and yet maintain the necessary provisions and supplies. Learned, in short, how to make a better pyramid. Just as there is little evidence that the system of nomes and estates that provisioned those extraordinary enterprises was part of a sternly centralizing organization, so, too, beyond the near perfection of their silhouettes, the early pyramids were hardly the products of a massive mono-enterprise controlled in a modern way, but rather the products of a system which had allowed the practical free flow of intelligence, and retained that accumulated knowledge down through generations. As for Sneferu's role in all this, as the linchpin of the living state, both his office and his state gained clarity and definition with the building of his pyramids, with the invention of the gods, and the personification of almost every aspect of the kingdom. After Sneferu, the boon that the king gives is that the monarch and the officers of the court will continue to control all the aspects of the state that they so vigorously define and refined, so that it caters both for the living and for the dead, a contract measured out on the horizon of the living land. In Sneferu's pyramids. This, then, tells something of the impulses which kept Sneferu's masons bending at their work for half a century, yet left the scribes of later ages straining to explain it in dense religious texts. Pyramid building, of itself, had become a ritual activity, not in the sense that it required priests, or incense, or incantations, but as a national enterprise of offering in which all the different spaces of the pharaonic state, in life and death, had been defined and unified. 31. The Perfect Pyramid. Khufu and Giza, 2575 to 2550 BC. Sneferu's successor to the throne, and probably one of the old man's sons, was a certain Khufu, whose tomb is known today as the Great Pyramid of Giza. As with King Sneferu, the best part of the known history of Khufu's life and times is held within his building works, within his great unlettered pyramid, whose vast dimensions, extreme precisions and subtle architectural harmonies were never to be repeated in all pharaonic history, nor indeed, in any other culture. In practical terms, the labor of the Great Pyramid's construction was nothing that Sneferu's pyramid makers had not already undertaken during the previous half-century. Such an outrageous building project, indeed, could only have been realized at that specific moment in pharaonic history, when the dynamic of Sneferu's state machine was running fast in the second and third generation of court craftsmen still held the ability and experience to undertake such work, to build a pyramid, that is, whose completed bulk would be more than half as large again than any earlier pyramid, yet could be built within the lifetime of a king who, given Sneferu's long reign, was probably already past the first flush of youth. The pyramid was built upon the past. Virtually every technical aspect of King Sneferu's pyramid building projects was reassessed and rationalized and put to work at the Great Pyramid. In exactly similar fashion, the architecture of King Khufu's pyramid is the perfection of all earlier pyramids, the epitome of a powerful aesthetic that had driven the craftsmen of the Lower Nile since the time of the Badarian potters, to make a perfect abstract form within a chosen medium. Unlike the earlier pyramids, however, which show continuous processes of development and change in almost every aspect of their manufacture, the Great Pyramid immediately became the vademecum of royal tombs for the best part of a millennium. The reign of Khufu, therefore, represents both an ending and a beginning. Imagining the pyramid. Given the ambitions of Khufu's pyramid makers, it is hardly surprising that practical considerations underpin the planning of his pyramid, not the least of which was the selection of its location. All three of Sneferu's pyramids had been set on compacted beds of clay and gravel. There is precious little local building stone at either Maidum or Dahshur, and what stone there is in the nearby deserts is of such poor quality that its use may well have contributed to the bent pyramid's dramatic failure. So the substance of those three enormous pyramids had been shipped to their building sites, and some of it from considerable distances. The Red Pyramid, for example, derives its modern name from the unusual tint of its limestone blocks. And the only known quarries for such stone are in the Maidum hills, close by Cairo, some 20 miles away and on the east bank of the river. The enterprise of its acquisition, shipping, hauling, barge, canal and harbor building, must have been a major element in that pyramid's construction, absorbing considerable amounts of the state's resources. Unlike the valley plains of Maidum and Dahshur, the limestone plateau of Giza, one of the last ridges of valley limestone before the delta plains, held enormous reservoirs of good, strong limestone. Nearby, as well, there was a sheltered desert valley in the cliffs, ideal for the siting of a harbor through which the pyramid's fine Tyrrell limestones and Aswan granite could be conveniently shipped, along with provisions for the pyramid builders. A community that at its height would have consisted of at least 50,000 people. Above all else, however, the Great Pyramid's creation seems to have been dominated by the bitter experience of the bent pyramid's dramatic failure. For the same rock formation of which the Giza plateau is composed not only held large quantities of good quality building rock just a ramp's length from the pyramid's projected baselines, but also promised a firm footing for the pyramid itself, which at its conclusion would consist of some 5.5 million tons of rock piled on a 13-acre base. So, even though the pyramid was planned to stand upon a cliff top some 300 feet above the river's plain and would be situated far further north of Memphis than any earlier royal tomb, it was in fact a perfect place to build a great, grand pyramid. Nonetheless, the anxiety of its builders to continuously check and control the pyramid's stability during all phases of its construction suffuses every element of the Great Pyramid's architecture. In previous generations, at Sneferu's bent pyramid, as the building blocks were delivered and emplaced, and as the baselines in the internal corridors and chambers had twisted out of true, the masons had attempted to correct the distorting architecture, for it was essential to the accurate progress of the pyramid to maintain straight building lines as the pyramid rose up into the sky. Given the tools available, however, the pyramid makers had no means of measuring the massive movements that were taking place within the rising pyramid nor, indeed, those underway within the ground on which the pyramid stood. King Khufu's masons solved this problem by laying out their pyramid at the beginning of the work with an extraordinary accuracy and then rechecking its continuing integrity with almost every stone they laid, so that every tiny subsidence within that enormous and accumulating stack of stone was corrected as it occurred. At the same time, too, whilst conforming to the architectural specifications for a pharaoh's burial that had been developed in the time of Sneferu, the plan of the Great Pyramid's internal architecture was elaborated so that it contained a further set of architectural checks and balances, simple geometries by which the rising pyramid could be calibrated and controlled at almost every level of its stonework. So as the pyramid rose ever higher, a cat's cradle of verticals and diagonals was set down in the pyramid's internal architecture with an extraordinary precision that would continue to show the slightest movement in the stonework, such as occurred during the later stages of its construction, when some of the 50-ton granite blocks from which the burial chamber had been constructed, subsided, and then snapped and twisted out of True. From its beginning, therefore, the Great Pyramid was specifically designed to serve as its own theodolite, an instrument with which every stone was checked against another as it was laid, and the whole was checked against the point of north, as established in an alignment of the stars. And the system was adhered to with such extraordinary tenacity that it was only with the arrival of Napoleon's surveyors at the ending of the 18th century that any deviation from absolute geometrical perfection was measured at the pyramid. Before that time, most scientists had thought the Great Pyramid to be a perfect abstract measure. Isaac Newton, for example, had considered that, along with Solomon's temple, King Khufu's pyramid had held the measure of the universe within it. The state machine. The Great Pyramid's baselines would have been established at the beginning of King Khufu's reign, that is, around the first quarter of the 25th century BC. Earlier, on the death of Sneferu, the master builders must have surveyed and selected the site of the Giza plateau and thus made the novel decision to set their pyramid upon a cliff. Then, we may imagine, the craftsmen masons and their families, a courtly community several thousand strong, had set out from their settlements at Maidum and Dahshur and traveled north to Giza to establish the support networks that such grand-scale pyramid building required, to plan and oversee the excavation of canals to run from the river to the new harbor that would be situated in the valley by the Giza cliff. At this same time, too, they had to oversee the construction of accommodations, dockyards and warehouses, and to open local quarries and secure the supply lines for the delivery of fine limestone from the Tural quarries that was to be employed at certain key locations from the beginning of the work. Now, too, they had to re-establish the granite quarries at Aswan, for, though it had not been greatly used for building since King Djoser's day, blocks of Aswan granite would be used to build King Khufu's burial chamber and also for the various gigantic plugs and portcullises, which, in the traditional manner, were to block parts of the pyramid's internal corridors after the royal burial had taken place. Such was the amount of Aswan granite that would be required, some 2,300 tons of the dull red stone, and some of it quite early in construction, that its quarrying must have begun at the same time as work started on the pyramid itself. When the quarries and the supply lines were established, when the site had been surveyed and measured, and a small but perfectly aligned corridor had been cut into the rock to serve as the pyramid's first fixed point, when 450-ton blocks of Tural limestone had been set down to mark out the pyramid's cornerstones, then the avalanche would have begun. Some 40,000 workers were gathered to quarry and to ship and haul the blocks of stone onto the rising pyramid. If Khufu's pyramid makers had engaged the same sized workforce and built at the same rates as their predecessors had done at Sneferu's Red Pyramid, it would have taken less than 14 years to finish, a labor that, at its height, would have required 4,000 tons of limestone blocks to have been hauled up along the slick mud of the stone hauling ramps on each and every working day and set with great precision on the rising pyramid. For the first few years, therefore, when half of the pyramid's bulk would have been put in place, there would have been a considerable community of pyramid makers in their families living around the Giza plateau, and indeed the sparse remains of huts and fires from just this period have been excavated in the surrounding areas. No trace, however, has been found of Khufu's residence, which must have surely stood at Giza. There, too, would have been the households of the royal court, many of the people who would be buried in the neatly laid out rows of stone block mastabas and little pyramids that flanked the royal pyramid. The eastern cemeteries of this unique assembly contain the tombs of queens and members of the royal family group, those to the west of the Great Pyramid, members of the state administration, amongst them one Heminu, who appears to have been the eldest son of Nefertiti and thus part of the inner circle of the royal family. Judging by the position of his tomb, however, Heminu may also have taken an active part in the royal administration and indeed his court titles, as they are written on a remarkable statue from his tomb, describe him as a king's son and a considerable priest, with a variety of benefices, as a courtier, a royal scribe and seal-bearer, and as director of the music of the north and south. That another of Hemianu's titles also describes him as overseer of all the royal construction projects, has led some to claim him to have been Khufu's very own Imhotep and the Great Pyramid's designer. Yet there is little chance that an ancient nobleman could have performed such a modern function in the construction of a structure that is as much an exercise in craftsmanship and state logistics as in architectural design. Given the exceptionally fine workmanship of his tomb, however, and the remarkable graffiti that keep a tally of its building, it would not appear unlikely that Hemianu was involved in the organization of the royal building projects. His tomb, indeed, is surrounded by the tombs of other courtiers, whose titularize simply that they too may have been concerned with the organization of the royal labor force. In the manner of the times, however, the elegant fragments of relief that have survived the sad destruction of Hemianu's tomb chapel depict a bucolic idol, similar to that drawn in his parents' tomb at Maidum, rather than the dusty day-to-day realities of a pyramid-building court that was part of a unique urban community, living beside an ancient building site quite isolated from the rhythms of rural life. Rather than their decorations, it is the mastabas themselves that show something of the air of Khufu's court. Conservative and severe, these massive tombs, built entirely of rough stone blocks, are finished with a light and skillful touch, a pervading elegance, and austere perfection. Like the pyramid in whose shadow they all stand, their design is highly regulated, all of them in line, most of them the same size as their neighbors, and all of them faced with colossal yet precisely rusticated blocks of stone. And at their southeastern corners, many of these mastabas once displayed a special single slab of stone, a small rectangle of fine Tura limestone, most beautifully carved and painted, which named the person who was to be buried in the tomb. The same person whose image is also shown on the slab, seated most elegantly at a table loaded with loaves of bread, and surrounded by lists of offerings, the continuing transaction of the state in life and death that, under Khufu, had become a highly regulated reduction of the expansive arrangements of the earlier tomb chapels. Rarely, as in the case of Hemianu's tomb, is there a niche or serdab in these lines of mastabas to accommodate statues. Down in their burial chambers, at the bottom of a considerable shaft, a plain, rectangular wooden coffin held a linen-wrapped corpse, and set beside it were utensils, a few ceramic pots, some vessels of copper and of stone and, on occasion, a beautiful life-size head, an ideal portrait, made of fine white limestone. Every one of these is individually memorable, and all of them bear the curious rough scars of a line of chisel marks cut into their perfect finish, as if the sculpture had been scalped. As for Khufu's pyramid, though the very sizes of its blocks of stone, its orientation to the stars and even the exact angle of its rise were all derived from Sneferu's pyramids, everything had been elaborated and made more precise. In 1881, when the young Flinders Petrie undertook the definitive survey of its architecture, he could find no error whatsoever in the angle of the first of its internal corridors, and errors of less than a few inches, and many, indeed, far less than that, between the craggy reality of the pyramid's exterior, which has been largely stripped of its fine outer casing, and the perfections of an ideal pyramid of the same size. The four final baselines, for example, hold a combined error in them, a deviation from geometrical perfection, of less than 7 inches in 755 feet 9 inches. Such extreme precisions would be very difficult for modern builders to maintain. The ancient builders worked to tolerances far smaller than those of modern building codes, and their errors, as far as they exist at all, would be undetectable with the use of a metal surveyor's tape, which in the sun's heat would expand by yet larger amounts. Khufu's pyramid makers did not use modern plans and numbers but the pyramid's own geometry, and they worked at full size. apart from those rare instances where some subsidence has occurred. The only places in this extraordinary monument in which modern surveying equipment can detect substantial inaccuracies are those where the pyramid makers could not control their architecture with the tools available to them. Fingers touch along a row of stones, the comparison of a horizontal line with a line of water, or a vertical line with a plummet and a chord. The builders' reliance upon geometry, upon stretched chords in the stars, meant that they used very few fixed measurements during the pyramids' construction. Apart from the baselines, which were fixed at 440 cubits, the best part of its specifications were derived from two related grids whose squares were 1/6 of the baseline's length, and between them these controlled both the geometric web of corridors inside the pyramid and the angle of its sides. Such grids had been used in pyramid construction from the beginning. Drawings from both Djoser's and Sneferu's times show ancient builders using grid coordinates to set up similar angles in their architecture, whilst the horizontal lines of the step pyramids, of course, had provided the pioneer stone block builders with a system of coordinates that was built into the stone of their exteriors. Such simple methods, a line divided and then subdivided several times and angles set on grids, had controlled the weaving of the Fayum farmers, where the weft and warp of looms had held the geometric complexities that underpin all weaving work. Similar geometries were built into the Fayum farmers' grain baskets. Later, they would control some of the designs of the Naqshband pottery painters. By itself, of course, such pattern making did not employ the mathematics that we now often use to explain how such ancient processes were undertaken, but they were, quite simply, the lifeblood of the ancient crafts, and it was natural for the pyramid makers to employ them. In similar fashion, the Great Pyramid's architectural design was also based upon those of its predecessors, the angle of its rise precisely imitating the smooth surfaces of the final phase of Sneferu's pyramid at Maidum. Neither Sneferu's nor Khufu's designers, however, used the modern expression of 51 degrees 50 to measure the angle of that rise, employing instead a simple system of grid coordinates. In similar fashion, the eccentricities of the Great Pyramid's interior architecture are but elaborations of traditional designs. The ceiling of the corridor that leads to the burial chamber, for example, the celebrated Grand Gallery, with its soaring corbel vault built on enormous blocks of stone, resembles the modest prehistoric constructions made in mud brick that were first reproduced in rough stone in Sneferu's Maidum pyramid. Inside the Great Pyramid, the ancient forms of its predecessors were enlarged and then distorted by the application of its particular design grid. In similar fashion, Khufu's burial chamber, a vast prefabricated granite box, is but an enlargement and adaptation of Djoser's funerary vault. Likewise, the mechanisms of the granite plugs and portcullises, that series of colossal mobile geometries designed to block parts of the pyramid's internal architecture after Khufu's burial, were all derived from those used in earlier tombs. As with everything in this perfect pyramid, the difference is one of scale and of the perfection of its workmanship, the culture of most ancient Egypt taken to another level. After the pyramid, when the pyramid had been finished, when its four great cliffs of Tural limestone were polished to a shine, when the great stone hauling ramps that had stood upon its southern face had been taken down and the volume of its stone and rubble had refilled the quarry which had supplied the bulk of the pyramids building stone, after all of that, the builders kept on working. The noble cemeteries were extended. Chapels were built onto many of the mastabas, and sometimes their original designs were enlarged and altered. The graffiti in Heminu's tomb, for example, suggests that he was still alive when the Great Pyramid was finished, but that he had died by the 19th year of Khufu's rule, when his mastaba was in a third stage of enlargement. Now, too, when the pyramid was finished, buildings could be constructed in areas that were previously inaccessible due to the construction work. 3. Minor pyramids were built close to the pyramid's eastern side to house some royal queens, and another miniature pyramid, such as had stood by some of Sneferu's pyramids, was set close to them, this last addition perhaps an echo of the secondary sepulchral complex that had been built in Djoser's pyramid enclosure. At the same time, too, a splendid offering temple of basalt, granite and limestone with an open courtyard and a shadowed column hall with statues of the king, was set at the center of the pyramid's east face. An enormous causeway was constructed that, with the support of a high stone ramp, ran from this temple, over the cliff top and down to the edge of the cultivation in the plain below, where, it would appear, another temple had once stood. On the walls of these now largely vanished buildings the royal craftsmen cut fine reliefs, of which the merest fragments have survived, images of offering bearers carrying the goods of Khufu's estates up to the temple by the pyramid, fragments of scenes of woodcutting, cattle wrangling and other activities on the royal estates, and of boat building and said festivals, all beautifully made, but pitifully broken. Khufu died after ruling for at least 26 years, and his funeral rites, a solemn graffiti by his pyramid record, were conducted under the aegis of Dahshur, who appears to have been his son and successor to the throne. After his sarcophagus was closed, the portcullises had thudded into place, and the great granite plugs had filled parts of the pyramid's internal architecture. After the entrance to the pyramid had been closed with blocks of Tural limestone, the work of Khufu's court was finished. Only the continuing ceremonies of the royal cult in the pyramid's dark temple witnessed the state activity continuing in Khufu's name. As for the pyramid makers, they had moved northwards to another hill, where they would build a pyramid for Dahshur. Nothing of Khufu the man is known. As in the days of Sneferu, the usual inscriptions were set into the red rocks of the Sinai copper mines. Khufu's core men made another, too, in the alabaster quarries at Hatnub, whilst a few brief graffiti cut into the boulders at Aswan record the presence of some of the members of his court at the settlement which provided granite both for his pyramid and for his plain and uninscribed sarcophagus. In 1900, at Abydos, in an ancient temple built over the remnants of an archaic shrine, Petrie found a unique tiny ivory figure of an enthroned king bearing Khufu's name. Its chubby face bears some resemblance to a few royal heads of granite and limestone, which, though uninscribed, are from the same period and are often claimed to represent King Khufu. In the year 2000, deep in the Sahara, some 300 miles west of Memphis, a desert explorer found the names of Khufu and Dahshur scratched into the surface of an enormous cone of rock. It seems that both those kings had sent expeditions into the western desert to recover a substance that the text describes as mayfat, which appears to have been a red ochre of especial brilliance. The rock on which the ancient expedition leaders, Bibi and Imri, left their graffiti had been a way station for desert voyagers since Naqadan times. Expeditions such as the pharaohs had mounted required hundreds of men and donkeys, both to sustain mining and to travel on such distant tracks, which stretched far further and, mysteriously, deep into the Sahara, south and west, towards Chad and the Sudan. That the rock graffito naming Khufu announces that it was made at the time of his 13th cattle count provides the unique information that the king had probably enjoyed a 26-year reign at least, ample time, therefore, to build the Great Pyramid of Giza. Like many kings before him, Khufu was provided with a means of river transport after death. 5 wooden boats were buried in deep pits beside his pyramid, 2 of which were obscured by later building works and thus, remarkably, survived. One of them still lies, disassembled, underground. The other was excavated in the 1950s and restored with an extraordinary skill by Hag Ahmed Yusuf and a team of restorers from the Service d'Antiquité. The beautiful result, after many years of work, was the reappearance of one of Khufu's river craft, its planks still shining from the wear of the ancient ropes that its crew had coiled up and buried with the boat. It is a swing-holed vessel with the same profile that the Naqadan artist had drawn upon the wall of the painted tomb at Hierakonpolis almost 1,000 years before, a design that, even in those far-off days, had echoed the shapes of yet more ancient craft that groups of hunter-gatherer fishermen had made from bundles of papyrus stalks pulled up into a graceful curve, to ply the prehistoric Nile. The tomb of Khufu's mother. Scribbled in the excavation diaries of the Harvard-Boston Giza expedition, and annotated by its stern director, Dr. George Andrew Reisner, equals Gar, this terse note signaled the beginnings of one of the most remarkable archaeological enterprises ever undertaken, in much of it performed close to the Great Pyramid, in an ancient rock-cut vault no larger than a suburban drawing room, and set some 80 feet beneath the surface of the plateau. Most of the cemeteries of King Khufu's nobles, those bleak rows of repeating mastabas as regular as plots in a modern cemetery, were excavated during the first half of the last century by two great archaeologists, Hermann Juncker, a German Jesuit professor at the University of Vienna, who after some 15 seasons left the Windy Plateau to investigate the prehistoric settlement of MaidumThe, and George Reisner, a Harvard professor, who had started work at Giza in 1902 and died there, 40 years later, in his expedition house. Both men had studied at Berlin, the great center of Egyptology during the early 20th century, and both of them had imbibed its curious vision of ancient Egypt as a culture at once primitive and savage and yet as intellectually consistent as Henry Ford's production line. Like all great archaeologists, Reisner had supreme self-confidence. He also had great affection for Egypt and especially for the villagers with whom he worked throughout his life. He trained them to excavate, photograph and document in his demanding way, and thus built one of the finest excavating teams ever to have worked in Egypt, a team, so it transpired, suitable not only for doggedly working through the lines of tombs of Khufu's nobles, but also for the excavation of the decayed contents of a single tiny chamber with unremitting care, and thus preserve one of those rare points of immediacy, those vivid flashes of reality, that stand out from the usual run of ancient history. Mohammedani Ibrahimi, one of Reisner's photographers, had first spotted a tomb of plaster in the freshly excavated bedrock of an open area behind the line of the three small pyramids that stand to the east of Khufu's pyramid. The following week, the plaster slab was cut away to reveal several rows of chunky Tura limestone blocks, a building method regularly employed by the funerary masons of King Khufu's day to seal the shafts that lead into the burial chambers of the Giza mastabas. That these blocks were undisturbed signaled to the archaeologists that they had uncovered the mouth of a shaft which had been sealed since the day of its ancient closure. At the same time too, the shaft, positioned in the middle of the open area that Reisner had dubbed Queen Street, rather than at the center of a mastaba, informed its excavators that it may have been part of a tomb which had been cleared away when the three nearby pyramids were built, a reorganization of the cemetery that had hidden the shaft from the plunderers who had visited most of the other tombs within the Giza cemeteries. After removing some 30 feet of filling from the shaft, a mix of limestone blocks, dust, stones and plaster, the archaeologists came across a small side chamber which held an ox head and some beer jars, an offering, it appeared, that had been made at the time the tomb was sealed. And then, at almost 90 feet, and at the bottom of the pit, they came across another wall of limestone blocks, which closed its southern side. On taking down the wall, the archaeologists found themselves in a short open corridor whose ending was blocked by yet another stone block wall. At first, a single stone was taken out. It was then late in the afternoon and the sunlight had gone, Reisner reported. By the light of a candle he, an expedition archaeologist, Alan Rowe, saw only dimly a chamber, a sarcophagus, and a glimmer of gold. Without further opening up the chamber, which was brimful of antiquity, a mass of gold, silver, pottery and faience lying in a gossamer of decay beside a stone sarcophagus, it took 3 days of gazing through a pair of field glasses to make out the cartouche of Sneferu emblazoned on a thick gold sheet. Ro had opened an intact tomb of a member of the royal family, a tomb some 15 centuries older than Tutankhamun's, whose discovery just 3 years earlier had already attuned the world's media to thrilling tales of pharaohs. Hidden gold. This tomb, however, did not contain the treasure of an unknown boy king, but quite possibly that of Khufu, the builder of the Great Pyramid, or that of his father, Sneferu. At all events, the discovery promised a fresh pharaonical sensation. Reisner was teaching in America as his team were clearing the burial shaft at Giza, and when he heard their news he ordered the shaft to be reblocked, the surrounding area fenced off, and a guard to be mounted at the end of Queen's Street to await his arrival. 10 months later, when press excitement had abated, and after a deal of careful planning, he traveled to Egypt, leisurely back through London and Paris, and then, and only then, was the ancient shaft reopened and the last wall taken down so that the work could begin. In the 4.5 millennia that the treasure had rested in its tiny limestone vault, the wood of which the best part of its contents had been made, had desiccated, shrunk and twisted and, following a leak of water into the chamber, it had further suffered the effects of a slow-growing fungus. In consequence, the joints of the furniture and the numerous storage boxes which had been stacked around the alabaster sarcophagus had been forced apart and had then decayed so that, over the centuries, much of their golden coverings and inlays had shook like lizard skins, dropping down in the silent darkness to lie amongst an accumulating mass of dust and decay. So Reisner and his assistants had to deal with a royal treasure that time had rendered into a tumbled mass, which lay across the chamber floor like cigar ash mixed with golden foil, with broken basketry, leather and linens and a mass of precious inlay scattered all about, as well as a considerable store of pottery that had originally been piled up against the furniture within the chamber but which, as the woodwork had disintegrated, had dropped down and rolled through the accumulating debris on the floor. That this most fragile of all ancient treasures was not blown away in a blast of publicity and hasty archaeology is entirely due to Reisner, to his stubbornness that month-on-month insisted on a forensic deposition of everything within the tomb, with artists, photographers and restorers in continual attendance, and with Reisner lying on a mattress, inching week by week ever further into the little room, accompanied by a series of assistants, one of whom, he noted approvingly, possessed especially long arms. They were a full 2 months into the work before they knew whose tomb it was that they were emptying. Then, one day, as he was lifting lines of some beautiful golden hieroglyphs that had been part buried in the dust, Reisner reassembled them and translated them as the titles of the mother of the king of Upper and Lower Egypt, guide of the ruler, favorite lady whose every word is done for her, and finally, the name of Hatshepsut, an entirely unknown person who, so her title seemed to tell, had been a daughter of King Huni, a wife of King Sneferu, and the mother of King Khufu, whose funerary workshops, so some of the impressions on the mud ceilings found on jars within the chamber now showed, had prepared her tomb for burial. On they went, measuring, drawing, photographing, and note-taking in the tomb chamber of Queen Hatshepsut, clearing fragments of her furniture and jewelry, of her baskets, her storage boxes and her caskets, some of which had been so heavily inlaid with semi-precious stones and faience that they looked for all the world like the inlaid decorations in the chapels of the Queen's relatives at Maidum. Here, then, were piles of sticks, and a royal bed complete with a wooden half-moon headrest. Here, too, were the disassembled elements of a great golden canopy, whose poles, along with its accompanying golden boxes, made to hold the linen curtains, had been laid on top of the sarcophagus. And in the deep, grey dust they found the decayed remnants of the Queen's jewelry box still holding 20 silver bracelets, each one inlaid with fragments of lapis lazuli, turquoise and carnelian, set in the form of butterflies. Given the manner of her times, Hatshepsut might well have worn these bracelets all at once. Though such pearls had long since been pictured in the tomb reliefs, This set is the only one that is known to have survived. There were, however, but a few fine, hard stone jars within the tomb, the rest being cut from soft alabaster and for the most part rather badly finished, an indication that the venerable industry had all but disappeared. Here, though, were heaps of domestic pottery, all newly made and smashed and never used. Lamps and basins, storage pots, cooking bowls and jars for yogurt making, and a most elegant pair of cups with a small serving jug all made of bright yellow gold. And there, too, was a box set of toiletries, little pots for oils and unguents, some copper razors and flints, and a copper washing basin with a jug. These, then, are the personal possessions of a grand old lady, the relics of a courtly life transformed into a deathly trousseau, packed into an underground chamber measuring 17 feet by 9. And at the ending of the work, when all the fragments had been mapped, measured and photographed and placed on a series of wooden trays and lifted to the surface, a small gathering of the great and the good came down into the tomb to welcome the ancient queen back into the realm of the living. Then, finally, the lid of the sarcophagus was opened and, like that of King Sekhemkhet, it proved to be, as Reisner dolefully described, as empty as the day it had been made. Even with Reisner's detailed records of their clearance, it took 20 years to restore Hetep's belongings to something like their original condition, among those involved in the work being a young man, Ahmed Yusuf, who would later be responsible for the near 30-year program of conservation and restoration of one of Khufu's cedar boats. 2 magnificently proportioned short-legged chairs were reconstructed from among the mass of furnishings. One of them had been heavily inlaid with semi-precious stones and faience in the same dense, carpet-like patterns of some of the boxes in the tomb, a manner that resembled the checker designs which had been painted on the exterior walls of some of the archaic mastabas. The second chair, however, was a light and clever design of abstract panels, and set into its sides were 2 elegant versions of the hieroglyph for delta, a bunch of curved papyrus stems tied heraldically together in a motif that would be constantly repeated in furniture and architecture throughout pharaonic history. The golden inscription bearing the names and titularies of King Sneferu that Ra had spotted at the tomb's first opening proved to have fallen from the side pillars of the great golden canopy, an ingenious copper-jointed structure made of wood, entirely covered in gold sheets soldered with pure silver. Restored and re-erected, gold and linen in the sunlight, it formed a rectangular frame some 10.5 feet long and 7 feet high with 4 round poles shaped like some of the slimly swelling columns of King Djoser's architecture set along 3 of its sides. This grand open tent could have served as a canopy for the royal bed inside the royal palace, or for a sunshade in the desert, just as it could also have served as the queen's embalming tent and, later, as a catafalque to cover the sarcophagus in a full-size burial chamber. Nearby, inside the Great Pyramid, within its colossal burial chamber, Khufu's sarcophagus would probably have been surrounded with a similarly refined range of objects. Yet there was no body in the little chamber. All the archaeologists recovered of the queen herself were 4 small packets of her entrails, some of them still steeping in a solution of natron which had been poured into the various partitions of a splendid alabaster chest that had been placed in a carefully sealed recess in the chamber wall. An explanation of Hetep's absence, the normally taciturn Reisner proposed in Ali Baba Arrived Tales. More recent and less elaborate hypotheses have proposed that she may originally have been buried with her grave goods in a full-size burial chamber underneath a modest pyramid which, late in Khufu's reign, and after the Great Pyramid had been finished, had been taken down as part of the new plan for the cemetery of the royal family, at which point, her body may have been taken for reburial, possibly beneath one of the 3 now ruined pyramids that stand close by, whilst her original burial goods had been reburied in the jumbled heap that Reisner would so painstakingly retrieve. What is so typical of ancient Egypt, and so touching in all this, is the extraordinary change of scale, the tantalizing contrast between the queen's cups and razors in the blank enormity of the Great Pyramid. Yet both had tapirs. Golden cups in the stones of Khufu's pyramid hold a similar integrity of skill and workmanship within them. Only the scale of the enterprise had changed. And they are all the products of a vision of profound simplicity, a vision that in earlier millennia had perceived a unity and symmetry in the luscious environment of the valley of the Lower Nile and had created a society in harmony with those unique surroundings. And in the reign of Khufu of the Fourth Dynasty, they built a pyramid whose harmonious perfection was the perfection of the prehistoric state. Judging by the size of Hetep's restored palanquin, a box-like chair with two long carrying poles, she must have been a tiny woman. Looking at its hard, flat, plain seat, one wishes her cushions for the ride, such as are shown in images of carrying chairs in later tomb chapels, where nobles are pictured visiting their farms and tombs, a little lady with a stick, dressed in linen, with silver bracelets on her arms. From the golden caps of its two carrying poles to the plain box of its wooden chair, which is edged in stripes of glittering gold patterned in the manner of a reed mat, the palanquin, like all the queen's possessions, is exquisitely proportioned. Similarly, the golden hieroglyphs from which Reisner had recovered Hetep's name, jewelers' masterpieces that, though but a fraction of their size, are the equal of the painted hieroglyphs from the Maidum mastabas, had been set in three thin columns and mounted on strips of ebony, fixed to the outside of the palanquin's backrest. Though small, this flashing chair would have identified the little queen as she was carried out from the palace to visit her estates and, perhaps, to view the progress of her tomb beside her son's great pyramid, high on the desert cliff. And yet our real knowledge of these ancient people hardly extends beyond their pyramids, their tomb chapels and names and titularies. We know nothing, for example, of those who carried Hetep's in her palanquin, and though we possess her very intestines, we know nothing of the woman or the queen at all. As we have seen, it is convention, rather than hard proof, that describes her as the daughter of King Huni, the wife of Sneferu and the mother of King Khufu. And it is precisely this mix of intimacy, anonymity and grandeur, at once alien and familiar, which is so very fascinating. But then again, the greater part of what survives from early Egypt is exactly what those ancient people took pains to store and thus preserve within the dryness of the desert, an ancient presentation.